My name is Clara Gallagher, and I am 32 years old. At our annual family reunion, surrounded by 150 guests, my father-in-law grabbed the microphone to boast about how his son was single-handedly saving the family legacy and keeping a roof over Grandpa Charles' head. He laughed into the microphone and told the entire crowd that my only contribution to the family was picking out the right color for the table napkins. But the laughter died in an instant when Grandpa Charles stood up, grabbed the microphone right out of his hand, and held up a thick stack of cancelled checks for his $2.8 million estate. He looked my father-in-law dead in the eye and asked a simple question that would destroy their lives forever. So who really paid for it? Before I tell you what happened next, if you enjoy stories about justice and setting strict family boundaries, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely connect with this story. Also, I would love to know where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. Drop a comment and let me know. To understand why that moment at the family reunion shattered the Gallagher family completely, I need to take you back to where the nightmare truly revealed itself. It was a Sunday evening at the Oak Ridge Country Club. The dining room was a cavern of dark mahogany crystal chandeliers and the overwhelming scent of expensive roasted meats and aged bourbon. It was the kind of place where people spoke softly about money, but shouted about everything else. I was sitting at a large round table near the center of the room. My husband Bradley sat to my right, looking perfectly at ease in his tailored suit. To my left sat my father-in-law Robert. Robert was a man who took up entirely too much space, both physically and emotionally. He had a loud, booming voice that he used like a weapon to dominate every conversation. He was holding court that night with two of his longtime golf buddies men who nodded at his every word because they enjoyed the free drinks he constantly ordered for the table. I sat there in my modest navy blue dress, holding a heavy crystal water glass, feeling like an outsider who had accidentally wandered onto a movie set. I am a senior corporate auditor. My entire career is built on examining financial structures, finding discrepancies, and identifying where the truth ends and the lies begin. I spend my days looking at spreadsheets, tax returns, and corporate balance sheets. But that night I was forced to sit in silence and audit my own marriage in real time while the men around me spun fairy tales. The conversation had shifted from golf scores to the economy, and then, as it always did when Robert had consumed more than 3 glasses of scotch, it shifted to me. Robert leaned back in his heavy leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, and pointed a thick finger in my direction. He looked at his friends with a wide, mocking grin. "You know," Robert said, his voice carrying over the gentle clinking of silverware in the dining room, "I always tell Bradley he did a great public service. He rescued Clara here from a life of boring spreadsheets. She used to be just another working-class girl crunching numbers in a cubicle. Now she gets to sit at Oak Ridge and eat $50 steaks." One of his golf buddies chuckled, raising his glass in a mock salute. Another added a comment about how lucky I was to marry into the Gallagher family, a family with deep roots and deep pockets. They all laughed, a chorus of privileged men congratulating themselves on their inherent superiority. Robert was not finished. He leaned closer to the center of the table, making sure everyone, including the waitstaff, could hear him. "Clara has this cute little job as an accountant," he continued, completely ignoring the fact that I am a certified corporate auditor who manages multi-million-dollar accounts. "But we all know she does not have to worry about a thing. Bradley takes care of her. He provides the lifestyle. She just gets to play with her calculators to feel independent. It is adorable, really." The blood rushed to my ears. A hot, prickling wave of humiliation washed over my face. I looked down at my plate, my hands trembling slightly under the heavy linen tablecloth. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted a metallic tang. I desperately wanted to look at Bradley. I wanted my husband, the man who had promised to protect and stand by me, to speak up. I waited for him to gently correct his father, to defend my career, or to simply change the subject. Instead, Bradley chuckled. He actually chuckled. He reached over, patted my hand condescendingly, and smiled at the men across the table. "She tries her best," Dad Bradley said, easily. "But you are right. She knows she hit the jackpot with us. She never has to worry about the heavy lifting." That was the moment the illusion of my marriage began to fracture. The physical toll of biting my tongue was agonizing. The expensive steak on my plate looked like ash. The rich red wine tasted like vinegar. I sat there, forcing the corners of my mouth into a polite, frozen smile, while my mind screamed with the brutal, undeniable reality of our financial situation. They truly believed their own lies. They sat in that country club wearing expensive watches and tailored suits, projecting an image of generational wealth and unshakable stability. But because I am an auditor, I know exactly what hides beneath the surface. I know the truth that Robert and Bradley were desperately trying to ignore. The truth was that the Gallagher family was drowning. They were entirely bankrupt in every way that mattered. Robert had squandered his inherited wealth years ago on terrible business investments and a quiet but devastating gambling habit. The country club membership we were currently enjoying, the $50 steaks they were chewing, the very drinks they were raising to mock me, were all paid for by a credit card that was in my name. For 3 years, I had been the silent, invisible pillar holding up their crumbling empire. When Robert defaulted on a massive business loan, it was my salary that covered the interest payments to keep him out of court. When Bradley wanted to start his own consulting firm, an endeavor that had yet to turn a single dollar of profit, it was my savings that provided his seed money. I worked 60-hour weeks climbing the corporate ladder, earning a substantial six-figure income, only to funnel it directly into the gaping black hole of the Gallagher family debt. I was the sole reason they were not standing in a bankruptcy court. Yet in their minds, I was just a charity case. I was the freeloader. This freeloader myth was a narrative Robert had carefully constructed from the day Bradley and I got engaged. Because I came from a hard-working, blue-collar family, Robert had decided I was a gold digger. He loved to introduce me to his wealthy friends by highlighting my humble beginnings, using my background to elevate his own status. He painted a picture of a generous, wealthy family taking in a poor, simple girl. It dictated how I was treated at every holiday, every family gathering, and every dinner party. At Thanksgiving, I was expected to arrive early and help the catering staff in the kitchen while the Gallagher men smoked cigars on the patio. At Christmas, my gifts were always practical household items or kitchen gadgets, while Bradley received expensive golf clubs or vintage wines. They treated me like an employee who had accidentally been invited to the main table. I endured it because I loved Bradley, and because I genuinely cared about Grandpa Charles, the patriarch of the family. Grandpa Charles was the only Gallagher who treated me with genuine respect. He was a retired naval officer, a man of profound integrity and quiet strength. He lived in a stunning historic estate worth $2.8 million, a home he had built with his late wife decades ago. That house was his sanctuary, and protecting him was the only reason I had allowed my finances to become entangled with Robert and Bradley in the first place. 3 years ago, Robert came to me in a panic. He had secretly leveraged Grandpa Charles' estate to cover his gambling debts. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Robert begged me for help, sobbing in my living room, promising he would pay me back, promising he would change. Bradley pleaded with me, telling me we could not let his grandfather lose his home and his dignity. So I did what I always did. I fixed the problem. I completely drained my personal savings money I had worked for since I was 20 years old to pay the $400,000 arrears. Since that day, I had been quietly paying the $15,000 monthly mortgage from my own high-paying auditor salary. I set up a direct transfer bypassing Robert completely to ensure the bank was paid and Grandpa Charles was safe. Grandpa Charles had no idea. Robert and Bradley had sworn me to secrecy, claiming the truth would give the old man a fatal heart attack. I agreed to stay silent, bearing the massive financial burden alone, believing I was protecting an innocent man. And this was my reward. Sitting at the Oak Ridge Country Club, listening to the men whose lives I had saved mock my career and call me a freeloader. Bradley squeezed my hand again, pulling me back to the present moment. "You are awfully quiet tonight, Clara," he said, his tone laced with a warning. "You should mingle more. Dad is just joking around. Do not be so sensitive." I looked at my husband. I looked at the man who slept next to me every night, a man who knew exactly how much money left my bank account on the first of every month to keep his father out of federal prison. He knew the sacrifices I made. He knew I had not bought a new piece of clothing in 2 years, so he could maintain his country club image. He knew everything, and yet he chose to humiliate me to appease his father's fragile ego. "I am fine, Bradley," I said, my voice eerily calm. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "I am just listening. I learn a lot by listening." Robert let out a booming laugh, slapping the table. See, that is what I like about her. She knows her place. She's a good listener. Not like these modern women who think they need to run the world. Clara is happy just being taken care of. Right, Clara? I looked directly into Robert's eyes. Behind his arrogant smirk, I saw the deep, pathetic insecurity of a man who knew he was a fraud. I saw a man who was terrified of being exposed. Yes, Robert, I said softly, setting my glass down on the crisp white linen. I am very happy to know exactly how this family operates. They took my calm response as submission. The conversation moved on, returning to golf handicaps and stock market trends they barely understood. But as I sat there for the remainder of the dinner, listening to the clatter of silverware and the hollow laughter of wealthy men, the last remaining thread of my loyalty snapped. I realized that my sacrifice was not noble. It was enabling. I was not protecting a family. I was funding a delusion. By hiding their financial ruin, I had allowed them to continue believing they were superior. I had allowed them to treat me as less than human. I finished my dinner in silence. I did not argue. I did not defend my career. I did not point out that my salary was the only thing standing between Robert and absolute destitution. As an auditor, I knew that arguing with a fraud was useless. You do not argue with a fraud. You simply present the evidence and let the numbers speak for themselves. When the bill arrived, Robert made a grand show of reaching for it only to quickly pat his pockets and claim he had left his wallet in his golf bag. Bradley immediately looked at me, a silent, panicked demand in his eyes. Without a word, I opened my purse, pulled out my sleek corporate credit card, and handed it to the waiter. "Thanks, sweetie," Bradley muttered, looking relieved. "I will transfer you the money tomorrow." He would not. He never did. As we walked out of the country club into the cool night air, Robert clapped Bradley on the back. "Great dinner, son. Glad we could treat Clara to a nice night out." I stood by the valet's stand, feeling the chilly breeze against my skin. I watched them laugh together, two men perfectly comfortable, living a lie. But the silence I maintained that night was not submission. It was preparation. I decided right then and there that the Gallagher family had taken their last dollar from me. The freeloader myth was going to be dismantled piece by piece, and I was going to be the one to tear down their kingdom. The very next morning, the reality of my position in the Gallagher family was laid bare on my kitchen island. It was barely 7 in the morning, and I was already nursing my second cup of black coffee, staring at a spreadsheet on my laptop. This was not a corporate audit for one of my large corporate clients. This was the master planning document for the annual Gallagher family reunion. This event had somehow become my sole responsibility year after year simply because I was the daughter-in-law who was expected to be useful. My phone buzzed across the marble countertop. The caller ID flashed Robert. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the familiar wave of exhaustion, and answered the call. Clara Robert barked into the receiver, completely skipping any form of a normal greeting. "I just spoke to the tent rental company. They are trying to give us the standard white canvas for the estate loan. I told them absolutely not. We need the clear top marquee tents with the draped chiffon lining. This is the Gallagher reunion, not some cheap backyard barbecue. You need to call them and fix it right now." I pulled my laptop closer and my fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Robert," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "The clear top tents are 3 times the price of the standard ones. We are already over budget with the catered prime rib and the string quartet you insisted on booking." I could hear him scoff through the phone. It was a sharp, dismissive sound that made my jaw clench tight. "Do not bother me with the pennies, Clara," he sneered. "That is what you are good at, right? Crunching numbers. You have a flexible schedule with that little accounting job of yours, so I expect you to handle these logistics. You need to earn your keep around here somehow. Make sure the florist uses white hydrangeas and not those cheap carnations you picked last year." He hung up before I could reply. I slowly lowered the phone as the words, "earn your keep," echoed in the quiet space of my kitchen. I looked up just as Bradley shuffled into the room, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and reaching for a clean mug from the cabinet. "Was that Dad?" Bradley asked as he poured himself some coffee. "Yes," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "He wants to upgrade to the clear marquee tents and switch the floral arrangements to white hydrangeas. He also reminded me that I need to earn my keep by playing unpaid event planner for 150 people. Bradley sighed loudly. He leaned against the counter and offered me a lazy, placating smile that did absolutely nothing to calm my nerves. "Come on, Clara," he said easily. "You know how he gets about the family reunion. It is the biggest day of the year for the whole family. He just wants everything to be perfect at Grandpa Charles' place. You're so good at organizing things anyway. Just humor him, okay? It is not like you're paying for it." I stared at my husband. The absolute audacity of his statement was staggering. It took every single ounce of professional discipline I possessed not to scream at the top of my lungs. Because the truth, the massive and suffocating truth that governed every waking moment of my entire life, was that I was paying for it. I was paying for absolutely all of it. I turned my eyes back to the spreadsheet and forced myself to focus on the address listed at the top of the event catering contract, the historic Gallagher estate. It was a sprawling, magnificent property built in the 1920s, sitting on 4 acres of pristine manicured land. It was worth $2.8 million. It boasted original hardwood floors, a grand sweeping staircase, and a beautiful library filled with rare first editions. It was Grandpa Charles' pride and joy. The estate was the physical manifestation of his lifetime of hard work and his honorable naval service. And exactly 3 years ago, it was 24 hours away from being seized by the bank. The memory of that night is burned into my brain with perfect, terrifying clarity. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in November. Bradley and I were sitting in our living room watching television when the doorbell rang frantically. I opened the door to find Robert standing on our porch. His face was pale and his expensive cashmere coat was completely soaked from the heavy rain. He shoved his way inside our house and collapsed onto our sofa, sobbing uncontrollably like a child. It took Bradley nearly 20 minutes to calm his father down enough to get a coherent sentence out of him. When Robert finally spoke, the words brought our entire world crashing down around us. He confessed that he had taken out massive high-interest loans against Grandpa Charles' estate. He had forged Charles' signature to secure the debt, leveraging the $2.8 million property to the absolute maximum limit. Robert claimed the money was for a guaranteed business venture that went south, but I am an auditor. I deal in facts and evidence. I demanded to see the paperwork right then and there. When I finally forced him to hand over the bank statements, I traced the funds in less than an hour. There was no business venture. There were offshore betting accounts, luxury car leases, and massive high-stakes poker losses. Robert had literally gambled away his elderly father's home. The bank had already issued the final notice of foreclosure. The arrears, the immediate cash needed just to halt the auction and reinstate the loan, was an astronomical $400,000. I remember standing in my living room holding those bank statements and feeling physically sick to my stomach. Robert was on his knees, literally begging me. He knew I had money. I had worked grueling 60-hour weeks since the day I graduated college. I lived frugally, I invested aggressively, and I had built a personal savings portfolio of over $450,000. It was my hard-earned security. It was the foundation for the family Bradley and I had planned to start together. "Please," Clara. Robert had wept loudly. His hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of my coffee table. "If the bank takes the house, Charles will find out. The shock will kill him. He is 88 years old. He cannot end up in a state-run nursing home. I will pay you back every single cent, I swear to God. I will get a job. I will sell my cars. Just please do not let my father die homeless." Bradley had fallen to his knees right next to him. He grabbed my hands with tears streaming down his own face. "Clara, please," Bradley begged. "It is Grandpa. We cannot lose him. We can fix this, but we need your help. I will do whatever it takes." I loved Grandpa Charles dearly. He was the only person in the entire Gallagher family who had ever asked me about my day. He was the only one who had ever treated me with genuine warmth and respect. The thought of the bank locking him out of his own home and stripping him of his dignity in his final years completely broke my heart. I trusted my husband. I believed his desperate promises. So the very next morning, I went to the bank. I liquidated my investment portfolios. I emptied my high-yield savings accounts. I transferred exactly $400,000 to the lender and stopped the foreclosure auction with less than 6 hours to spare. But the nightmare did not end there. The modified loan terms required a staggering monthly mortgage payment of $15,000 just to keep the estate out of default. Robert, of course, had absolutely no income. His assets were deeply leveraged or already repossessed. Bradley made a modest salary that barely covered our own basic household expenses. The crushing financial burden fell entirely on my shoulders. For the past 36 months, I had been working myself to the bone. I took on extra corporate clients. I accepted every grueling audit assignment that required exhausting overnight travel. I funneled $15,000 of my own hard-earned money every single month into an escrow account that paid the mortgage on Grandpa Charles' estate. I set up the entire system to be completely invisible. I created a blind trust so Charles would never see my name on the bank drafts. I wanted him to live his final years in total peace. I wanted him to remain completely unaware that his own son had nearly destroyed him and completely unaware that his granddaughter-in-law was working herself into an early grave just to keep a roof over his head. I sacrificed my peace of mind. I sacrificed my financial security. I sacrificed my dreams of starting a family, all to save the Gallaghers from total ruin. And how did Robert and Bradley repay me for this massive sacrifice? They simply rewrote history. Once the immediate danger of foreclosure was gone, Robert stopped crying and started spinning a brand new narrative. Within a month, he was back at the country club bragging to his friends about a brilliant financial restructuring plan he had orchestrated. He told the extended family that the estate had faced a minor tax issue, but that he and Bradley had stepped in, pooled their resources, and saved the family legacy. They became the absolute heroes of the family. At every single holiday gathering, aunts and uncles would raise their glasses to Robert and Bradley. They praised them endlessly for their incredible business acumen and their steadfast devotion to Grandpa Charles. Charles himself would clap his son and grandson on the shoulders with his eyes shining with pride. He thanked his good boys for taking such wonderful care of him in his old age. And where was I during these touching family moments? I was exactly where Robert had just ordered me to be on the phone. I was pushed into the background managing the caterers, picking out the napkins, keeping quiet, and earning my keep. They had stolen my life savings, they hijacked my monthly income, and then they entirely erased my contribution. They painted me to the rest of the world as a gold-digging freeloader who was simply along for the ride, enjoying the fruits of their imaginary labor. Bradley never once corrected them. He enjoyed the praise from his relatives far too much. He enjoyed playing the role of the successful and wealthy son. He completely ignored the fact that his wife was wearing 3-year-old shoes and losing sleep over balancing our own grocery budget because every spare cent we had went straight to his grandfather's house. I blinked and pulled my focus back to the glowing screen of my laptop. Bradley was still standing in the kitchen sipping his coffee and looking perfectly content with his life. "Did you hear me, Clara?" he asked, entirely oblivious to the storm raging inside my head. "Just call the tent people and fix it. Dad wants this reunion to be a total showstopper. He wants everyone to see how well the family is doing right now." I looked at the catering invoice waiting to be paid. It was for $12,000, a deposit for the prime rib and the expensive champagne that Robert wanted to serve to 150 people on the lush lawn of a $2.8 million estate that he did not pay for. I stared at the numbers, feeling the sheer weight of the injustice pressing down on my chest. I had given them everything I had. I had protected them from public disgrace and financial ruin. And in return, I was treated like a glorified servant. "I will handle it, Bradley," I said smoothly. My voice was calm and professional and entirely devoid of the boiling rage that was building inside me. "I will make sure this family reunion is exactly what your father deserves." Bradley smiled widely, completely, missing the heavy double meaning in my words. "Thanks, babe. You're the best. I have got to get to work." He set his mug down in the sink and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the quiet kitchen. I looked back down at the spreadsheet. I had spent 3 long years protecting this family from the devastating consequences of their own actions. I had allowed myself to be humiliated, dismissed, and drained dry because I truly believed in sacrifice and loyalty. But sitting there, listening to the echoes of Robert, demanding I earn my keep, the blinders finally fell away completely. I was not saving a family. I was funding a delusion. And the illusion of the Gallagher men saving the day was about to shatter into a million pieces. I sat at my kitchen island staring down at the catering invoice. It was for $12,000. A 50% deposit required to secure the prime rib, the champagne, and the string quartet for the annual Gallagher family reunion. I pulled my sleek corporate debit card from my leather wallet. This was the card linked to our joint savings account, where I kept my carefully accumulated emergency funds. I dialed the phone number listed at the top of the invoice. A cheerful woman named Susan answered the call, ready to process the payment. I read her the 16 digits over the phone, speaking clearly and confidently. I waited for the familiar sound of a keyboard clacking and the cheerful confirmation that the transaction was successful. Instead, there was a long and intensely uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. Susan cleared her throat and her tone shifted from bubbly to apologetic. She told me that her system was showing a declined transaction. I laughed a nervous, breathless little laugh and told her to please try running the numbers again. I knew for an absolute fact that I had over $75,000 in that specific account. There was simply no logical way a $12,000 charge would bounce. Susan tried running the card a second time. The result was exactly the same. A sharp, hot prickle of embarrassment crept up the back of my neck. I apologized profusely to the caterer, promising her I would call back to sort out the bank error, and then I quickly hung up the phone. I immediately opened the mobile banking application on my phone. My thumb was already moving on autopilot. I typed in my passcode with absolute certainty, expecting to see a temporary freeze or a fraud alert on the screen. The dashboard loaded, and my heart stopped dead in my chest. The breath was literally knocked out of my lungs. The available balance displayed in bold black text was $342. I blinked hard, squeezing my eyes shut and opening them again. I refreshed the page, pulling down on the screen with a frantic thumb. I logged out completely and logged back in, hoping it was just a strange server glitch. The numbers stared back at me, unchanged and unapologetic. $74,600 had completely vanished from the account. I clicked into the transaction history, and my fingers were trembling so violently I could barely tap the glass screen. There it was, sitting at the very top of the ledger. A massive wire transfer initiated exactly 48 hours ago. The money had not been stolen by some anonymous internet hacker. It had not been seized by the government. It had been routed directly into a private wealth management account belonging to my father-in-law, Robert Gallagher, Bradley. My husband, the man I had trusted with my life and my finances, was the only other human being on the planet with access to that specific account. The kitchen suddenly felt suffocatingly small. The pristine marble countertops and the gleaming stainless steel appliances looked like a fragile movie set that was rapidly collapsing around me. That money was my ultimate safety net. It was the security blanket I had built over years of working 60-hour weeks. It was the money I earned sleeping in cheap airport hotels while traveling across the country for grueling corporate audits. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind and my own youth to build that savings account. And my husband had simply handed it over to the very man who had nearly destroyed our entire family 3 years prior. I sat on a wooden bar stool for 3 agonizing hours, waiting for Bradley to come home from work. I did not cry a single tear. I was too terrified and too furious to cry. My analytical mind was racing through 1,000 different scenarios, trying desperately to find a logical, benign explanation. Maybe it was an honest mistake. Maybe the bank made a massive routing error. But deep down in the core of my stomach, I knew the absolute truth. I am a professional auditor. I know a deliberate, calculated wire transfer when I see one. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, the heavy mahogany front door opened. Bradley walked into the house wearing his expensive tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase, and smiling like he did not have a single care in the entire world. He dropped his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door and strolled into the kitchen. He leaned over, intending to kiss my cheek, but I pulled away sharply. He stopped in his tracks and looked at me with a genuinely confused expression. "What is wrong with you?" he asked, casually. I turned the laptop screen toward him. It displayed the digital wire transfer receipt in full high definition. "What is this, Bradley?" I asked. My voice was eerily calm, but it felt like a tightly coiled metal spring inside my throat. "Where is my $75,000? Bradley looked at the glowing screen. He did not look surprised. He did not look guilty or ashamed. He just let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket. "Clara, I was going to tell you about that tonight over dinner," he said smoothly. He walked past me over to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. Dad and I found an incredible opportunity. It is a high-yield business investment in a massive commercial real estate project downtown. The returns are absolutely guaranteed to be over 20% in the first year alone. We needed liquid cash immediately to secure our equity position. It was a highly time-sensitive deal. I stared at him in absolute total disbelief. "You took my entire emergency savings without asking me," I said, my voice rising slightly. "You wired $74,000 to a man who literally gambled away his own $2.8 million estate. Are you completely out of your mind?" Bradley slammed his water bottle down on the marble counter. The sharp sound echoed aggressively through the large kitchen. "Do not talk about my father like that," he snapped. "He learned his lesson from that ordeal 3 years ago. This is a legitimate, secure investment. We are building generational wealth, Clara. You're always harping on about financial security and planning for our future. Well, this is how you actually build it. You have to spend money to make money." I stood up from the bar stool. The blinding anger was finally burning straight through the initial shock. "I am a senior corporate auditor, Bradley," I reminded him fiercely. "I analyze high-yield investments for a living. Show me the prospectus. Show me the operating agreement. Show me the exact corporate entity that holds this supposed investment right now." Bradley rolled his eyes and crossed his arms firmly over his chest. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and intense irritation. "This is exactly why I did not tell you beforehand," he said condescendingly. "You are way too stressed from your demanding job. You're always looking for a major problem where absolutely none exists. You spend 10 hours a day digging through corporate fraud, and now you are projecting that paranoid delusion onto your own husband. You are acting completely hysterical right now, Clara. Just calm down and trust me for once in your life." The word hysterical hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. He was gaslighting me. He was standing in the center of a kitchen in a house that I practically funded, looking me dead in the eye and telling me that my completely rational panic over stolen life savings was just a symptom of female hysteria and work-induced stress. He walked over and reached out, trying to place his hands gently on my shoulders. I took a massive step back, completely repulsed by his physical touch. "Clara, you need to take a deep breath," he said softly, employing the patronizing, soothing tone he used when speaking to a frightened child. "You are just exhausted. It is busy season at your accounting firm, and you are severely overreacting. The money is perfectly safe. Dad is handling the portfolio with his brokers. We are going to be incredibly rich. Just let the Gallagher men handle the big business decisions for a change. You just focus on planning the family reunion and picking out those floral arrangements." He turned around, walked out of the kitchen, and headed upstairs to take a shower, leaving me standing completely alone in the echoing silence. I did not follow him up the stairs. I did not scream. I did not throw plates against the wall or break down sobbing. I stood in the dead silence of the kitchen and felt a profound, chilling transformation take place inside my own mind. For years, I had treated Bradley as my equal partner. I had treated Robert as a deeply flawed but ultimately harmless father figure. I had operated under the naive assumption that we were all on the same team. But a team does not steal $74,000 in the dark of night. A team does not invoke the arrogant phrase Gallagher men while simultaneously dismissing the very woman who was currently paying the $15,000 monthly mortgage on their precious historic family estate. The emotional, devastating betrayal washed over me, but it was rapidly eclipsed by something far more dangerous: complete professional clarity. In my line of work, when a corporate executive casually dismisses a missing $75,000 as a high-yield investment without producing a single piece of documentation, it means one undeniable thing. It means they are hiding a massive catastrophic liability. It means fraud. I walked over to the kitchen sink and splashed freezing cold water on my face. I looked out the window at the darkening suburban street. The naive, devoted wife who desperately wanted to believe in the inherent goodness of her husband's family died in that kitchen. In her place stood Clara Gallagher, the senior corporate auditor. I realized right then and there that I could no longer afford to treat my marriage as a sacred emotional bond. I had to treat my marriage exactly like a hostile corporate entity that was actively bleeding my assets. I had to run a full-scale, unauthorized forensic audit on my own household. I waited for 4 agonizingly slow hours. I deliberately went through the motions of a normal, quiet evening. I heated up leftover pasta for dinner. I sat on the living room couch while Bradley watched a basketball game on the television. I smiled when he made a casual joke. I nodded agreeably when he told me once again to relax and trust his financial judgment. I played the role of the pacified, submissive wife flawlessly because I knew that the absolute greatest advantage an auditor can possess is the element of total surprise. When a fraudster believes they have successfully manipulated you, they get incredibly sloppy. They lower their defenses and they leave a digital trail. At 11 o'clock, Bradley stretched and announced he was going to bed. He fell asleep within 10 short minutes, his breathing becoming deep and even. I lay wide awake next to him in the dark, staring up at the ceiling and counting my own heartbeats. When the digital clock on the nightstand finally flashed 12:30, I slowly and silently slid out from under the heavy down comforter. I grabbed my personal laptop from the bedroom chair and quietly walked downstairs to the home office. Bradley kept his personal financial files and the specific documents related to Robert's so-called investments in a locked filing cabinet in his study. He also had a powerful desktop computer that he fiercely guarded. He thought he was incredibly clever. He thought that because I worked long, grueling hours downtown, I paid absolutely no attention to his daily digital habits. But Bradley was not a trained financial professional. He was an arrogant, overconfident man who used the exact same 4-digit PIN code for his cellular phone, his tablet, and his desktop login screen. I sat down in his heavy leather desk chair and powered up the large monitor. The screen immediately cast a pale blue glow across the dark, quiet room. I typed in his 4-digit code without a second of hesitation. The desktop unlocked instantly. My professional instincts were humming loudly now. A sharp electric focus settled over my entire body, pushing the marital grief completely out of my mind. I opened his email client and deliberately bypassed the primary inbox, diving straight into the deleted folders and the hidden archived messages. I opened his cloud storage drives. I began systematically searching for specific keywords: investment, transfer, Robert, escrow, estate. I was looking for the paper trail of my stolen $74,000. But what I was about to find would prove to be infinitely more horrifying than a simple stolen savings account. The missing money was just the tip of a massive, devastating iceberg. The real conspiracy, the true terrifying depth of the Gallagher men's depravity, was waiting for me hidden in plain sight inside a digital folder labeled simply Grandpa Charles Estate Planning. I took a deep, steadying breath, flexed my fingers over the glowing keyboard, and began the audit. The freeloader was about to do her job. The silence of the house was absolute and suffocating. The only sound in the entire room was the soft, rhythmic humming of the desktop hard drive and the steady, heavy beating of my own heart. I sat in Bradley's large leather desk chair, feeling the cold draft from the window seeping through my thin cotton pajamas. But I was not shivering from the chill in the night air. I was shivering from the terrifying reality of what I was about to uncover. I moved the mouse across the pad and hovered the cursor over the digital folder, simply labeled Grandpa Charles Estate Planning. For a brief, fleeting second, a tiny, naive part of my brain begged me not to click the mouse. That small, desperate voice whispered that once I opened this door, there would be absolutely no going back to the way things were. My marriage would be entirely over. The life I had built would burn straight to the ground. But the senior corporate auditor inside me, the woman who had spent years hunting down financial discrepancies and exposing corporate liars, demanded the unvarnished truth. I double-clicked the folder. The screen immediately populated with dozens of highly detailed files. They were meticulously organized with color-coded tags and date-specific naming conventions. This was my very first major red flag. Bradley was notoriously lazy and disorganized. He routinely left wet towels on the bathroom floor, and he never filed his own tax returns on time without me hounding him. This precise level of digital organization meant someone else was pulling the strings. It had Robert written all over it. I scanned the file names slowly. I was desperately looking for anything related to the supposed high-yield commercial real estate investment Bradley had used to justify stealing $74,000 from our joint savings account. I opened subfolders labeled Investments and Portfolio Growth, hoping to find something legitimate. They were completely empty. There were no corporate prospectuses. There were no legal operating agreements. There was absolutely no legitimate business venture to be found. It was a massive phantom. It was a convenient, hastily constructed lie designed to pacify a wife they believed was too stupid and too submissive to ever actually verify the financial facts. My stomach churned with a sickening mixture of professional vindication and profound personal disgust. They really thought I was a naive idiot. I redirected my attention to the main directory of the folder. My eyes immediately locked onto a PDF document titled Confidential Property Valuation Report. It was dated exactly 14 days ago. I opened the file and my breath caught painfully in my throat. It was a massive 120-page professional real estate appraisal. It was not a simple free online estimate. It was a deeply comprehensive on-site commercial assessment of Grandpa Charles' historic estate. I scrolled through the pages, my horror growing with every single click. The report detailed every single square inch of the 4-acre property. It listed the original 1920s hardwood floors, the grand sweeping staircase, the pristine manicured lawns, and the rare architectural details of the massive library. It also included a highly detailed zoning analysis, highlighting the potential to completely subdivide the massive lot to build high-density luxury townhomes. I scrolled rapidly to the final executive summary page. The official appraised commercial value sat there in bold black ink, $2.85 million. Why would Robert and Bradley need a highly confidential commercial appraisal of a property they did not intend to sell? Why would they ever order a commercial zoning analysis for luxury townhomes on the exact spot where Grandpa Charles was currently living out his final years? I felt a cold, prickly sweat break out across my forehead. I closed the appraisal document and frantically opened the very next file in the folder. It was a signed legal contract. The header bore the embossed logo of a high-end private real estate brokerage firm based in downtown Seattle. I recognized the name immediately. It was a notoriously cutthroat firm that specialized exclusively in discreet off-market property sales for ultra-wealthy clients who desperately wanted to avoid public real estate listings. I read through the specific terms of the agreement, and my blood ran ice cold. Robert Gallagher had officially retained this broker to quietly market Grandpa Charles' estate to private, aggressive commercial developers. The contract explicitly stated that the property was being sold strictly off-market to ensure a rapid cash transaction without raising any public attention or alerting the local neighborhood association. My eyes scanned down to the fee schedule section of the brokerage contract, and the final piece of the horrifying puzzle snapped into place with a sickening emotional thud. The broker required a massive upfront, non-refundable retainer to cover the costs of the private marketing, the zoning attorneys, and the discrete site surveys required for a commercial teardown. The exact amount of the required retainer was $75,000. I stared at that number until it physically burned into my retinas. The $74,600 that Bradley had stolen from my emergency savings account just 48 hours ago had not gone into a high-yield business investment. It had gone directly to this sleazy off-market broker to cover the retainer. My own husband had robbed my personal bank account to pay the legal fees to sell the very house I was currently bleeding myself dry to save. I pushed my chair back from the desk and pressed my trembling hands against my face. The sheer scale of their depravity was almost impossible for my brain to fully comprehend. I thought about Grandpa Charles. He was 88 years old. He spent his peaceful days sitting in his beautiful sunlit library, reading his first editions and looking out the large bay window at the rose gardens he and his late wife had planted 50 years ago. That house was his entire world. It was his safe sanctuary. He implicitly believed his son and his grandson were his fiercely loyal protectors. He actually believed they had heroically saved his home from foreclosure 3 years ago. He had absolutely no idea that they had actually been the ones to jeopardize it in the first place through illegal gambling debts. And he certainly had no idea that they were currently plotting to sell his home right out from under his feet to a commercial developer who would happily tear down his historic sanctuary just to build cheap modern townhouses. And then there was my pathetic role in this absolute nightmare. For 36 grueling months, I had been transferring $15,000 of my own hard-earned corporate salary to the bank to pay the massive mortgage on that estate. I had sacrificed my own youth, my own peace of mind, and my own dreams of achieving financial independence just to keep the aggressive bank away from Grandpa Charles' front door. I did it willingly because I loved that sweet old man and because I believed in protecting innocent family members. Robert and Bradley knew this. They knew exactly how hard I worked. They knew I was the sole reason the beautiful estate had not been auctioned off on the courthouse steps 3 years ago. Yet they were planning to legally sell the property, pocket the nearly $3 million in pure cash profit, and leave Grandpa Charles utterly homeless in the final vulnerable years of his life. And they were using my stolen emergency fund to finance the precise execution of their evil plot. I forced myself to sit back down and pull the keyboard closer to my chest. I needed more evidence. I needed to understand exactly how they planned to pull off the actual legal sale of a massive property that Grandpa Charles still personally held the legal title to. I minimized the brokerage contract and opened Bradley's email client again. I searched for direct correspondence with Robert. The search results yielded a long, highly encrypted email chain dating back 3 months. Bradley, in his infinite arrogance, had simply saved the password to his digital keychain. I clicked open the most recent message in the thread. It was an email from Robert to Bradley sent just last week. I read the glowing words on the screen and felt my entire body go numb. The email read, "Bradley, the broker says we need to act fast while the commercial market is piping hot. The developer from California loves the massive zoning potential and is willing to pay $3 million in pure cash for a quick 30-day close. We just need to get the old man out of the house for the final developer walkthroughs. Tell Clara to organize the massive family reunion at the estate next weekend. It will keep her busy and completely distracted with the catering and the flowers. Once the reunion is over, we will simply tell Charles the property taxes are getting too high and we have to move him into that assisted living facility across town. The power of attorney documents are already officially filed with the county. He will not even know the house is sold until the bulldozers show up. Power of attorney." I stared at those 3 specific words, feeling a massive wave of absolute nausea wash over me. Robert had somehow secured a broad legal power of attorney over his own elderly father. That was exactly how he was managing the off-market sale without Charles ever signing a single document. He had likely tricked the trusting old man into signing it under the innocent guise of helping with medical decisions or routine tax filings. With that document, Robert had full total legal control over the entire estate. He could sell it, liquidate the massive assets, and hoard the cash without Charles ever stepping foot inside a closing attorney's office. It was a flawless, ruthless, and incredibly evil financial plan. I sat in the dark, quiet study for a long time, letting the full, devastating weight of my discovery settle deep into my bones. The Gallagher men were not just arrogant country club snobs who liked to play golf and drink bourbon. They were calculating financial predators. They were perfectly willing to completely destroy the life of their own beloved patriarch just to secure a massive unearned cash payout. They viewed Grandpa Charles not as a beloved family member, but as a stubborn obstacle standing between them and a $3 million payday. And they viewed me not as a loving wife or a devoted daughter-in-law, but as a convenient, endless source of blind funding to be heavily exploited and then easily discarded. I thought about Bradley, laughing out loud at the country club dinner, telling his wealthy friends I was a lucky freeloader who hit the absolute jackpot by marrying into his family. I thought about Robert aggressively demanding I earn my keep by playing unpaid event planner for the massive reunion. They wanted me entirely distracted. They wanted me running around picking out expensive white hydrangeas and negotiating with snooty tent rental companies so I would not notice them dismantling the entire family legacy right under my nose. They genuinely thought I was a naive, compliant fool who would just smile pretty and serve the prime rib while they robbed an 88-year-old man blind. I reached over to the laser printer sitting quietly on the edge of the large desk. I loaded the tray with a fresh, crisp ream of paper. I opened every single document in that hidden digital folder. The fraudulent power of attorney emails, the confidential commercial property appraisal, the sleazy off-market brokerage contract, the digital wire transfer receipt for my stolen $74,000. I hit print on every single file. The printer whirred loudly to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable, heavily documented treason. I gathered the warm, freshly printed papers into my hands, organizing them with the meticulous, obsessive care of a seasoned auditor preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. This was no longer a struggling marriage. This was an active crime scene. I looked at the digital clock glowing on the bottom corner of the monitor. It was 3:15 in the morning. Upstairs, my husband was sleeping soundly, completely unaware that the obedient little wife he had constantly mocked and stolen from had just unearthed the detailed blueprint to his entire criminal enterprise. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the Gallagher men had already won the game. I turned off the bright monitor, plunging the study back into total, absolute darkness. I held the thick stack of printed evidence tightly against my chest. The crushing pain of my shattered marriage was entirely gone now, replaced by a burning, unyielding demand for absolute justice. I was not going to cry over spilled milk. I was not going to confront Bradley in the morning and pitifully beg for an explanation or an apology. I was going to do what I did best as a professional. I was going to follow the money. I was going to let them proceed with their arrogant little plan. I was going to let them host their lavish, boastful family reunion on the pristine lawn of the historic estate. And then I was going to burn their entire fraudulent kingdom straight to the ground. I sat in the dim light of Bradley's home office, with the freshly printed pages of the real estate appraisal resting heavy on my lap. The commercial property assessment and the sleazy off-market brokerage contract were certainly damning enough to completely destroy any normal marriage. But my professional instincts, the very same analytical skills that made me a top-tier corporate auditor, whispered that a financial conspiracy of this staggering magnitude required a legal architect. Robert and Bradley were incredibly arrogant and boundlessly greedy, but they were simply not brilliant men. They desperately needed a highly skilled lawyer to execute a $3 million real estate theft without triggering a massive tax audit or a federal criminal investigation. I turned my tired eyes back to the glowing computer monitor and began to dig much deeper into the digital trash bin. I systematically searched the hidden directories for terms like legal counsel, trust formation, and offshore asset protection. I sifted through hundreds of mundane daily emails about golf tee times and expensive country club dues. Just as my eyes began to physically burn from the harsh blue light of the large screen, I finally found it. It was a single long email thread buried deep inside a restricted folder labeled simply Tax Planning 2024. The original sender was a man named Harrison Caldwell. I recognized the name immediately. Harrison Caldwell was a notorious high-priced defense attorney in downtown Seattle who specialized almost exclusively in hiding massive assets for high-net-worth clients going through extremely nasty divorces. He was exactly the kind of man who happily charged $1,000 an hour to make millions of dollars completely disappear into thin air. I opened the heavily encrypted email thread and started reading from the very beginning. The initial message was sent by Robert exactly 2 months ago. Robert had laid out his greedy, malicious vision in plain text. He stated that he wanted to sell Grandpa Charles' historic estate, pocket the massive cash proceeds, and ensure that neither his elderly father nor his nuisance of a daughter-in-law could ever touch a single dime of the money. Harrison Caldwell had replied the very next morning with a highly detailed step-by-step legal blueprint. It was an absolute masterpiece of profound financial treachery. I read the cold, calculating words on the bright screen and felt the remaining warmth drain completely out of my body. Step 1 of Caldwell's plan was the rapid creation of a deeply shielded, irrevocable trust. The attorney instructed Robert to use the forged power of attorney to silently transfer the legal deed of the $2.8 million estate directly out of Grandpa Charles' name and into this newly formed trust entity. The trust would be established in a state with highly aggressive privacy laws, meaning the true owners could remain completely anonymous from public records. Robert would be legally named as the sole trustee and the sole financial beneficiary. Grandpa Charles would be completely stripped of his lifelong ownership without ever signing a single legitimate piece of paper. He would become a mere helpless tenant in the very home he had built with his late wife, completely at the mercy of his ruthless son. Step 2 was the rapid, discreet off-market sale. Caldwell heavily advised them to use the aggressive private brokerage firm I had already discovered in the previous folder. They were explicitly instructed to accept a slightly lower cash offer from the commercial developer to ensure the real estate transaction closed in less than 30 rapid days. Caldwell specifically warned them that a traditional public real estate listing would require public county records that might accidentally alert Grandpa Charles or myself to the impending sale. The entire massive transaction had to happen completely in the dark behind our backs. Step 3 involved the immediate complex laundering of the massive sale proceeds. As soon as the commercial developer wired the $3 million into the irrevocable trust account, Caldwell had prepared a vast network of offshore holding companies to receive the funds. The money would be rapidly bounced through a series of anonymous shell corporations located in the Cayman Islands, effectively vanishing from the legal jurisdiction of the United States tax system and any domestic civil courts. By the time anyone realized the beloved family estate had been sold, the money would be completely untouchable. Robert and Bradley would be rich beyond their wildest dreams, and the cash would be totally insulated from any legal claims I might try to make. But it was step 4 of the email thread that finally broke my spirit. Step 4 was entirely and exclusively about me. I scrolled down to the final long paragraphs of Caldwell's message and saw my own name staring back at me in bold black letters. Bradley had personally replied to the sleazy attorney, asking specifically how to handle his wife during this highly sensitive transition period. Bradley wrote that Clara is a senior auditor, and she monitors the joint bank accounts extremely closely. She is also the only one paying the $15,000 monthly mortgage on the property. If she gets suspicious and stops paying the mortgage before the off-market sale is officially complete, the bank will initiate foreclosure again and completely ruin the developer deal. Bradley asked the lawyer directly, how do we keep her paying the heavy bills until the cash safely clears the offshore accounts? Harrison Caldwell's professional response was pure calculated evil. He instructed Bradley to play the role of the loving, deeply supportive husband. He told Bradley to keep me incredibly busy and completely distracted with highly demanding family obligations, so I would be far too exhausted to notice the massive legal shifts happening in the background. Caldwell specifically suggested using the upcoming annual Gallagher family reunion as the absolute perfect decoy. Let her plan the entire massive event, Caldwell wrote in the email. Let her handle the expensive caterers and coordinate the massive outdoor tents. Let her drain her own physical energy, making the family look good to the country club crowd. It will feed her eager little ego and keep her entirely away from the financial documents. Then came the final crushing blow. Caldwell cleanly outlined the permanent exit strategy for my marriage. He told Bradley that once the off-market sale officially closed and the $3 million was safely hidden away in the Cayman Islands, Bradley needed to sever all ties with me immediately and without warning. Caldwell stated he had already drafted the official divorce papers. The plan was violently simple and incredibly cruel. Bradley was instructed to wait until the Monday morning directly following the massive family reunion. I would be completely physically exhausted from hosting 150 demanding people on the estate lawn all weekend. I would be totally emotionally depleted. And on that quiet Monday morning, while I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking my coffee, Bradley was going to have a ruthless process server knock on my front door and hand me divorce papers. Because Bradley had already secretly drained my emergency savings account, and because he had successfully funneled my massive corporate salary into paying the mortgage on an estate I did not legally own, I would be left with absolutely nothing. The divorce filings were specifically structured to stick me with the remaining heavy balances on the massive credit card debts Robert had previously racked up in my name. They were going to actively steal my youth, my hard-earned money, and my entire future. They were going to leave me completely bankrupt and entirely alone while they lived like absolute kings on a tropical island, using the wealth they had systematically squeezed out of my very veins. They had deliberately manufactured the entire grand illusion of the Gallagher family reunion just to keep me completely docile like a foolish working animal while they joyfully dug my financial grave. I sat alone in the dim, cold light of the study, and I finally completely broke. The sheer staggering magnitude of the betrayal crashed over me like a massive physical weight. I actually gasped for air, feeling a sharp, agonizing pain radiate straight through my chest. I doubled over the heavy wooden desk and buried my face deep in my trembling hands. I cried for the naive, hopeful young woman I had been 3 years ago. I cried for the staggering amount of wealth I had so foolishly handed over to a group of men who secretly despised me. I cried for the beautiful family I genuinely thought I was building with a husband who was actively plotting my total personal destruction. The tears flowed hot and fast, soaking the long sleeves of my cotton pajamas. I wept uncontrollably until my throat was completely raw and my eyes burned with fierce, exhausting pain. I felt like I had been violently hollowed out from the inside, leaving nothing but an aching, empty cavern. They had actively taken every single ounce of my inherent goodness, my fierce loyalty, and my quiet devotion, and they had weaponized it all directly against me. I felt incredibly stupid. I felt like the biggest, most pathetic fool in the entire world. But as I sat there weeping silently in the dark, something profound and unyielding began to shift inside my mind. The initial crushing wave of absolute devastation began to slowly, steadily recede. In its place, a new, highly unfamiliar sensation began to take deep root. It started as a tiny, sharp spark of heat, low in my stomach. It quickly traveled up my spine, automatically tightening my posture and drying the hot tears on my cheeks. The profound, heavy grief was rapidly transforming into something much harder and much colder. It was morphing into a pure, highly calculated, and absolutely terrifying rage. I slowly lifted my heavy head and stared fiercely back at the glowing computer screen. I was no longer the weeping, heartbroken, devoted wife. I was Clara Gallagher, the senior corporate auditor. I was a woman who routinely dismantled massive corrupt corporations for a living. I professionally destroyed arrogant, greedy men who truly thought they were much smarter than the rules. And Harrison Caldwell, Robert Gallagher, and Bradley Gallagher had just made the most catastrophic, fatal mistake of their pathetic, miserable lives. They had extensively documented their entire criminal conspiracy in plain writing. They had left a massive glowing paper trail of undeniable systemic fraud right on a desktop computer in my own home. They genuinely thought they were playing a brilliant high-stakes game of chess against a clueless, submissive opponent. They had absolutely no idea that I owned the entire board. I reached over and aggressively hit the print command on the keyboard. The heavy laser printer hummed loudly back to life, quickly spitting out page after page of Harrison Caldwell's highly detailed legal blueprint. I watched the warm sheets of paper fall into the output tray with immense cold satisfaction. I was not going to cry anymore. I was not going to confront Bradley in the morning and pitifully beg for an emotional explanation or demand we attend couples counseling. I was going to let them fully believe their sick, evil plan was working perfectly. I was going to smile brightly and plan their lavish family reunion right down to the final expensive white hydrangea. I was going to let Robert boast and brag endlessly to his wealthy country club friends about his imaginary business acumen. I was going to let Bradley pat my hand and pretend to be my loving, supportive husband. I would play my assigned part flawlessly. And when the massive trap was finally set, when they were proudly standing on the absolute peak of their arrogant mountain of lies, I was going to push them directly off the absolute edge. They wanted to serve me with cold divorce papers and leave me with absolutely nothing. Instead, I was going to completely dismantle their entire lives piece by meticulous piece until they had absolutely nowhere left to hide. I was going to tear down the Gallagher men and expose them to the entire world. The freeloader was about to collect her final devastating debt. The morning sun was just beginning to cast a pale gray light over the Seattle skyline when I backed my car out of the driveway. I had not slept a single second. The thick manila folder resting on the passenger seat contained the freshly printed evidence of my husband's ultimate betrayal. My mind was completely racing as I navigated the quiet suburban streets. I was heading straight toward the Oak Grove Assisted Living and Rehabilitation Center. Grandpa Charles had been staying in that facility for the past month, recovering from a routine hip replacement surgery. Robert had managed the medical transition, and he had convinced everyone in the family that Charles needed around-the-clock care for a few weeks before returning home. Now the sickening truth was painfully obvious. Robert was just conveniently clearing the house so he could bring aggressive commercial developers through the property without his elderly father ever noticing. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. A painful, terrifying question burned deep in my chest. Did Grandpa Charles know about the plan? Was the sweet old man who always treated me with such gentle kindness actually completely in on the plot? Did he know that I was bleeding my own corporate salary dry to pay his massive monthly mortgage while his son and grandson secretly planned to leave me bankrupt and divorced? I desperately wanted to believe Charles was entirely innocent, but the sheer staggering scale of the deception had completely shattered my ability to trust anyone with the last name Gallagher. I parked my car in the visitor lot of the care facility and took a very deep, steadying breath. I grabbed the heavy folder and walked through the sliding glass doors into the pristine, quiet lobby. I found Charles sitting in his private room near a large, bright window. He was fully dressed, drinking a hot cup of black tea and reading a thick historical biography. When he saw me step into the doorway, his weathered face immediately broke into a warm, genuine smile. "Clara, my dear girl," he said happily, setting his heavy book down on the small table next to him. "What a wonderful surprise. You're up awfully early for a Saturday morning. Come sit down and tell an old man about your busy week." I walked over and took a seat in the floral armchair directly opposite him. I did not return his warm smile. I simply could not pretend everything was normal for another single second. My chest felt incredibly tight as I looked into his kind, gentle eyes. I placed the thick manila folder directly onto the small round table between us. "Charles," I said, keeping my voice low and completely steady, "I need to ask you a very direct question, and I need you to tell me the absolute unvarnished truth. Do you have any idea what Robert and Bradley are currently planning to do with your estate?" Charles looked completely confused by my serious tone. He frowned slightly and leaned forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed reading glasses. He asked me exactly what I meant. He told me Robert was simply managing the property taxes and making sure the landscaping was maintained while he recovered from his surgery. I watched his face, carefully searching for any tiny microscopic flicker of guilt or deception. I saw absolutely nothing but innocent, genuine confusion. I reached forward and opened the heavy folder. I pulled out the confidential commercial property appraisal, the sleazy off-market brokerage contract, and the printed email thread from the corrupt defense attorney, Harrison Caldwell. "I need you to read these documents, Charles," I said softly. I sat there in heavy, suffocating silence as the elderly patriarch of the Gallagher family slowly began to read the paperwork. I watched as his eyes carefully scanned the lines of printed text. I saw his expression shift rapidly from mild confusion to deep concern and finally to absolute horrifying realization. His hands began to tremble so violently that the crisp white pages shook, making a harsh rustling sound in the quiet room. His breathing grew incredibly shallow and rapid. When he finally reached the specific email detailing the secret legal plan to sell his beloved home to a commercial developer and serve me with sudden divorce papers, he dropped the papers entirely. They scattered across the linoleum floor. Charles covered his face with his weathered hands. He let out a ragged, broken sound that completely shattered my remaining doubts. He was not a quiet co-conspirator. He was just another victim of their boundless greed. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking with profound, overwhelming grief. "I had absolutely no idea. I swear to you on my late wife's grave, I knew absolutely nothing about this terrible plan. They told me the house was perfectly safe. They told me they had fixed the financial issues 3 years ago. I took a slow, deliberate breath and finally told him the painful truth I had kept hidden for 36 long months. They did not fix anything, Charles said gently. 3 years ago, Robert gambled your historic home away. The bank demanded $400,000 immediately to stop the public foreclosure auction. I paid it. I completely drained my entire life savings to keep you safely in your home. And for the past 3 years, I have been paying the $15,000 monthly mortgage directly from my own corporate salary. Robert and Bradley have not contributed a single dime to saving your legacy. I am the only reason you still own that estate." Charles stared at me in total, absolute shock. Large tears welled up in his eyes and spilled over his deeply wrinkled cheeks. He looked completely devastated by the staggering magnitude of the revelation. He reached out with shaking hands and grabbed my own, holding them tightly. "You did all of that for me?" he asked, his voice trembling with heavy, thick emotion. You completely sacrificed your own financial future to protect an old man, and they are treating you like this. I am so deeply, incredibly sorry, Clara. I have raised an absolute monster for a son. I wiped a stray tear from my own cheek. The shared pain in the room was palpable, but I needed him to focus on the immediate legal danger. But Charles, I said, pointing down to the fraudulent documents scattered across the floor. Robert is actively using a power of attorney to transfer the legal deed of the estate into a secret, irrevocable trust. He's legally moving the house out of your name today, so he can sell it off market next month. Did you ever sign a broad financial power of attorney giving him control over your assets? Charles sat up completely straight in his chair. A sudden fierce clarity washed over his face rapidly, replacing the profound grief with a sharp, calculating intensity. He shook his head firmly. "No," he said, his voice suddenly ringing with the commanding, unyielding authority of a retired naval officer. "I never signed a broad financial power of attorney. When I first came to this rehabilitation center, Robert brought me a massive stack of medical intake forms to sign. He slipped a limited medical proxy into the middle of the pile, claiming the facility required it just in case of a severe medical emergency. He must have completely altered the documents after I signed them. He must have entirely forged my signature on a broad financial proxy." Charles leaned much closer to me, his eyes flashing with a dangerous bright light. "Clara," he continued, "I never ever transferred that deed. Robert begged me for 10 long years to put his name on the property title, but I completely refused every single time. I knew he was terrible with money. I knew about his reckless gambling habits. I knew he would inevitably squander his mother's beautiful legacy. I am the sole legal owner of that $2.8 million estate. If Robert filed a deed transfer with the county clerk, he committed outright felony fraud. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest since yesterday finally began to lift. We had the ultimate smoking gun. We had the absolute proof we needed. Robert and Bradley were not just planning a cruel divorce and a greedy property sale. They were actively engaged in massive systemic federal crimes. I looked at Grandpa Charles and saw exactly what I needed to see. He was no longer a frail old man recovering from a medical procedure. He was a furious, powerful patriarch who had just realized his own son and grandson were actively trying to completely destroy the innocent woman who had selflessly saved his life. "What do we do now, Clara?" Charles asked me, his voice completely steady and hardened with resolve. I sat back in my floral armchair and carefully outlined the devastating counterattack. I told him we were going to quietly hire the most ruthless, aggressive estate litigator in the entire city of Seattle. I told him we were going to secretly gather every single piece of financial evidence, every cancelled check, every digital wire transfer, and every forged county document. We were going to build an impenetrable fortress of legal proof. But more importantly, I explained we were going to let Robert and Bradley completely believe their flawless evil plan was succeeding perfectly. "We will let them spend thousands of dollars planning the massive family reunion," I said, maintaining steady eye contact with the older man. "We will let them invite the entire extended family and all of their wealthy, arrogant country club friends to the estate. We will let them bask in the fake glory of their imaginary wealth. I will keep smiling and picking out their expensive floral arrangements just like they want me to." And then I said, feeling a cold, brilliant smile finally touch my lips, "We are going to spring the trap. We are going to let Robert stand up in front of 150 people on the estate lawn and loudly boast about how he single-handedly saved the family legacy. And when he's entirely done talking, you are going to stand up and show everyone the absolute truth. We are going to completely dismantle their fake lives, Charles. We are going to take absolutely everything from them." Charles looked down at the forged legal documents scattered across the linoleum floor, and then looked back up at me. He slowly reached out and firmly shook my hand, sealing our quiet, devastating pact. "They want to play dangerous financial games with our money and our lives, Clara," he said, his voice as cold and hard as steel. "Then we will show them exactly how a real war is fought. Let them have their fancy family reunion. Let them enjoy the prime rib and the expensive champagne, because it will be the very last party the Gallagher men ever host." The very next morning, I took a personal day off from my corporate auditing firm. I picked up Grandpa Charles from the rehabilitation center. under the strict guise of taking him to a routine outpatient physical therapy appointment. Robert and Bradley were far too busy congratulating themselves at the country club to ever bother checking my alibi. Instead of driving to a medical clinic, I drove Charles directly into the heart of downtown Seattle to the sleek high-rise office of David Harrison. David was widely known as the most ruthless and terrifyingly effective estate litigator in the entire Pacific Northwest. He was a man who professionally dismantled greedy relatives for a living, and he charged a premium to do it. When we walked into his pristine glass-walled conference room, David listened to our story in complete silence. He reviewed the printed emails, the sleazy brokerage contract, and the confidential commercial appraisal. But when I slid the copy of the forged power of attorney across the polished mahogany table, his demeanor shifted entirely. He looked at Charles and asked him directly if he had ever signed away his financial rights. Charles looked the attorney dead in the eye and stated with absolute naval authority that he had only signed a limited medical proxy. David leaned back in his expensive leather chair and actually smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that made me incredibly glad he was on our side. He explained that Robert had committed massive multi-million-dollar fraud, and we were going to completely bury him under a mountain of legal injunctions. The legal warfare began that very same afternoon. David immediately brought in an independent geriatric psychiatrist to officially document that Charles was of perfectly sound mind and fully capable of managing his own vast estate. Once the medical evaluation was legally notarized, David moved with terrifying speed. He did not send a polite warning letter to Robert. He did not call the sleazy defense attorney, Harrison Caldwell, to negotiate a settlement. He went straight to a friendly Superior Court judge and filed a massive emergency injunction to completely freeze the fraudulent, irrevocable trust Robert had secretly created. But the absolute masterpiece of David's legal strategy was the lis pendens. He explained the concept to us with quiet, intense satisfaction. A lis pendens is a formal legal notice filed directly with the county clerk's office. It legally declares that the property in question is currently the subject of a massive pending lawsuit. David explained that the moment he filed that single piece of paper against the $2.8 million estate, it effectively killed the entire off-market commercial sale, completely dead. When the sleazy real estate broker eventually tried to run a standard title check for his aggressive commercial developer, the title company would immediately spot the lis pendens. No legitimate title insurance company in the United States would ever underwrite a commercial property transfer that was actively embroiled in a massive fraud litigation. The developer would immediately pull their $3 million cash offer and run for the hills. And the absolute most beautiful part of the entire strategy was that Robert and Bradley would have absolutely no idea the property was legally frozen until the sale violently collapsed at the absolute last possible second. With the legal trap perfectly set and quietly ticking away in the background, it was my turn to do the heavy lifting. I am a senior corporate auditor. I have spent my entire adult life professionally dismantling complex financial structures and exposing sophisticated corporate lies. Now, I was applying every single ounce of my professional training directly to my own deeply broken marriage. That weekend, I locked myself inside my home office. I told Bradley I was absolutely swamped with an incredibly demanding corporate account and needed total uninterrupted silence. He happily agreed, patting my shoulder and telling me to work hard while he went off to play a full 18 holes of golf with his father. He genuinely thought I was working overtime to funnel more money into his pockets. He had absolutely no idea I was actively building his financial coffin. I started from the very beginning. I opened a massive encrypted master spreadsheet and began pulling every single bank statement from the past 36 months. I went back to the freezing Tuesday in November 3 years ago when Robert had sobbed on my living room couch. I pulled the exact official wire transfer receipt showing my personal $400,000 payment to the mortgage lender that successfully halted the original foreclosure auction. I highlighted the date, told the routing numbers, and the undeniable fact that the money originated entirely from my own personal high-yield savings portfolio. Then I moved on to the monthly payments. I painstakingly downloaded every single canceled check and every single electronic transfer receipt for the $15,000 mortgage payments. month after month, year after year, row after row of undeniable financial sacrifice. I documented the exact path of the money flowing directly from my corporate payroll deposits straight into the blind escrow account that serviced Grandpa Charles' massive estate. I calculated the total sum of my contributions. When I highlighted the final cell, the number was absolutely staggering. Over a period of 3 long, grueling years, I had personally poured nearly $1 million of my own hard-earned money into saving the Gallagher family legacy. Robert and Bradley had not contributed a single solitary dime. They had simply taken all the credit and completely erased my existence. But I was not finished. A true forensic audit requires exploring every single discrepancy. I pulled the joint banking records and officially documented the $74,600 that Bradley had recently stolen from my emergency fund to pay the sleazy real estate broker's retainer. I linked the exact timestamp of his unauthorized withdrawal directly to the signing date on the brokerage contract I had discovered in his hidden digital folder. I created a precise, undeniable timeline that proved my husband had actively robbed me to finance the illegal sale of an estate I was currently paying for. The sheer volume of the evidence was incredibly overwhelming. As I sat in the dim light of my office, surrounded by hundreds of pages of printed bank records, I felt a profound sense of physical exhaustion wash over me. Looking at my entire adult life, quantified into rows of stolen cash and unappreciated sacrifice, was deeply painful. I had genuinely loved Bradley. I had truly wanted to build a beautiful life with him. I had given up my youth, my free time, and my financial security because I foolishly believed his promises. But the pain quickly transformed back into that cold, familiar rage. I channeled every ounce of my heartbreak directly into the work. I spent 3 full days compiling, organizing, and indexing the mountain of financial documents. I created massive detailed appendices cross-referencing every single wire transfer with corresponding emails and text messages. I printed out the entire sick email thread between Robert Bradley and the corrupt attorney Harrison Caldwell, proving their deliberate, premeditated intent to abandon me with massive credit card debts while they fled to the Cayman Islands. By late Tuesday night, the forensic portfolio was completely finished. It was an absolute masterpiece of undeniable truth. I had successfully built a bulletproof, impenetrable fortress of financial evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had financed every single square inch of the $2.8 million property. I drove to a 24-hour office supply store and purchased 5 thick, heavy-duty black binders. I spent the early hours of Wednesday morning carefully hole-punching the documents and assembling the final presentation. I created a perfectly tabulated index for each binder, making it incredibly easy for any judge, jury, or family member to follow the exact flow of the stolen money. I made 1 binder for Grandpa Charles, 1 for David Harrison, the attorney 1 for Robert, 1 for Bradley, and 1 for myself to keep as the master copy. When I finally snapped the last metal ring closed on the final binder, the sun was just beginning to rise over the quiet suburban neighborhood. I sat back in my desk chair and ran my tired hands over the smooth black cover. Inside those binders was the absolute total destruction of the freeloader myth. Inside those binders was the undeniable proof that the great wealthy Gallagher men were nothing but pathetic parasitic frauds. Later that same morning, I walked into the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. Bradley wandered in a few minutes later, adjusting his expensive silk tie and checking his reflection in the microwave door. He looked completely rested and incredibly arrogant. "Good morning, babe," he said cheerfully, pouring himself a large mug of the coffee I had just brewed. "How is that massive corporate account treating you? You have been locked in that office for days." I looked at the man I had married. I looked at the man who was actively planning to serve me with cold divorce papers the moment his offshore accounts were full of stolen cash. I kept my face perfectly neutral and offered him a tired, believable smile. "It is almost completely wrapped up," I said smoothly. "The audit was incredibly complex, but I finally found all the missing money. Everything balances perfectly now." Bradley laughed a short, dismissive sound and took a sip of his coffee. "See, I told you that you were just stressing yourself out over nothing. You always work too hard, Clara. You need to relax. Speaking of which, Dad wants to make sure you finalize the prime rib order for the family reunion this Saturday. He invited 50 more people from the country club, so we need to make sure the catering stuff is fully prepared. He wants everything to look incredibly lavish. I felt a sharp, cold thrill race straight down my spine. The absolute stunning arrogance of this man was going to be his complete undoing. He was happily ordering me to coordinate the catering for the very event he planned to use as a distraction for his massive real estate heist. He had absolutely no idea that the silent, obedient wife pouring his morning coffee had just spent the last 4 days legally freezing his stolen assets and building a forensic guillotine. "Do not worry, Bradley," I said, my voice soft and perfectly controlled. "I paid the catering deposit yesterday. The massive clear top tents are fully secured, and the florist is preparing the expensive white hydrangeas exactly like your father requested. The family reunion is going to be absolutely unforgettable." Bradley smiled warmly, completely oblivious to the lethal double meaning in my carefully chosen words. "You are amazing, Clara," he said, stepping forward to quickly kiss my cheek. "I know Dad can be demanding, but he really appreciates everything you are doing to make the Gallagher family look good. I will see you tonight." I stood in the kitchen and watched him walk out the front door, heading off to his fake consulting job in his expensive leased car. I slowly wiped my cheek where he had kissed me, feeling entirely disgusted by his fake affection. The trap was fully built. The legal injunctions were quietly filed with the county court. The lease pendants was firmly attached to the property deed, killing their secret commercial sale. And the 5 heavy black binders, filled with their complete financial destruction, were safely locked inside the trunk of my car. I spent the rest of the week flawlessly playing the role of the subservient event planner. I directed the landscaping crews I coordinated with the string quartet, and I personally supervised the installation of the massive, expensive marquee tents on the lush green lawn of Grandpa Charles' historic estate. I listened to Robert bark ridiculous orders at the catering staff, and I watched Bradley strut around the property, acting like the wealthy heir to a massive royal fortune. They were both standing incredibly tall, completely blind to the fact that the solid ground beneath their feet had already been completely removed. The annual Gallagher family reunion was only 48 hours away, and the freeloader was finally ready to deliver her devastating final audit. The final 4 days leading up to the Grand Gallagher family reunion were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I had to wake up every single morning, smile at the man who was actively plotting to destroy my life, and then spend my entire day physically building the exact stage he planned to use for his ultimate victory lap. By Thursday morning, the massive clear-top marquee tents arrived at the historic estate. I stood on the pristine green lawn with a clipboard in my hand, directing the installation crew, while the morning dew soaked right through my canvas sneakers. Robert emerged from the main house around 9 o'clock, carrying a steaming mug of expensive imported coffee. He wore a plush cashmere robe and a smug, satisfied expression. He strolled across the lawn, completely ignoring the heavy lifting the crew was doing, and walked straight up to me. He pointed his coffee mug toward the center of the main tent and told me that the dance floor was entirely off-center. He barked that I needed to make the crew tear it down and move it 3 feet to the left because the Gallagher family did not tolerate sloppy presentation. A week ago, I would have felt a sharp sting of humiliation. I would have quietly apologized and frantically rushed to fix the perceived mistake. But standing there with the absolute knowledge of his impending financial doom burning brightly in my mind, I felt nothing but cold, clinical amusement. I looked at Robert and offered him the most subservient, polite smile I could muster. I told him he was absolutely right, and that I would have the crew adjust the flooring immediately to meet his exacting standards. He grunted his approval, muttered something under his breath about how I needed strict supervision, and wandered back inside to his comfortable leather armchair. I spent the next 8 hours coordinating the arrival of the massive floral arrangements. Robert had demanded expensive white hydrangeas, and I made absolutely certain the florist delivered hundreds of them. I carried heavy crystal vases across the estate lawn, setting up the elaborate centerpieces, while my arms ached and my shoulders burned with physical exhaustion. I was acting as the unpaid event planner, the manual laborer, and the dedicated servant for a family that viewed me as nothing more than a convenient disposable asset. Bradley arrived at the estate late Thursday afternoon. He parked his heavily leased luxury sedan in the circular driveway and confidently strolled onto the lawn to inspect my grueling hard work. He did not offer to carry a single chair or help me hang the delicate string lights that Robert had insisted upon. Instead, he stood under the clear canopy of the main tent with his hands resting casually in his pockets and nodded in slow approval. "You actually did a decent job, Clara," he said, his tone dripping with profound condescension. "Dad is going to be incredibly pleased with how this looks. The country club crowd is going to be absolutely blown away by the sheer elegance of all this. It really shows off our family wealth perfectly." I wiped a streak of dirt from my forehead and looked at my husband. He was already completely lost in his sick delusional fantasy. He genuinely believed that within a matter of weeks, the $3 million offshore wire transfer would clear and he would be living the life of a wildly successful, wealthy bachelor. He looked at me not as a partner, but as a temporary utility that had almost reached its final expiration date. I swallowed the thick knot of disgust rising in my throat and forced my voice to remain light and cheerful. I told him I was so incredibly glad he liked the setup and that I just wanted everything to be absolutely flawless for his grandfather's special weekend. Bradley smiled warmly and stepped forward to kiss my forehead. He told me I was a good wife and that I just needed to keep up the hard work for 2 more days. The sheer sickening hypocrisy of his physical affection nearly made my stomach rebel. But I held my ground. I did not flinch. I let him play his arrogant, confident role because every single arrogant word he spoke simply added another heavy brick to the massive wall I had built to completely trap him. That evening, we sat around the massive mahogany dining table in the main house. Robert had ordered expensive takeout from a high-end steakhouse downtown using the credit card that was still entirely in my name. I sat quietly, pushing a piece of roasted asparagus around my porcelain plate while Robert and Bradley loudly discussed their bright financial futures. They were completely giddy with the toxic thrill of their impending real estate heist. Robert poured himself a generous glass of aged scotch and leaned back in his heavy chair. He looked at Bradley and loudly declared that next month they needed to fly down to Miami to look at some new boat models. Robert claimed he was finally ready to upgrade his lifestyle and enjoyed the fruits of his brilliant business investments. Bradley enthusiastically agreed, adding that he was personally considering trading in his current sedan for a brand new imported sports car. They sat there openly spending the $3 million they firmly believed they were about to steal from an 88-year-old man. And then Robert turned his sharp, predatory gaze directly toward me. "Clara," he said, tapping his fork against his plate, "I hope you made sure the caterers are bringing the premium cuts of prime rib. I have some very important local politicians attending this reunion, and I will not have my family embarrassed by cheap food. You have to understand that when you operate at our financial level, appearances are absolutely everything. You need to make sure you earn your keep on Saturday. I do not want to see you sitting around relaxing when there are guests who need to be served." I looked directly into his arrogant dark eyes. I knew for an absolute fact that the title company handling the commercial developer's escrow account had officially flagged the list pendants that very morning. My ruthless attorney, David Harrison, had securely placed the legal freeze on the property deed, making it totally and completely impossible for Robert to execute his secret sale. The entire massive off-market deal was already dead in the water. Robert was sitting at that dining table, aggressively bragging about a boat he could never afford, using money he would never see to impress people who were about to watch him burn to the ground. "I am not going to relax for a single second, Robert," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly accommodating. "I promise you that Saturday is going to be a day this family will never ever forget. I will be working right up until the very final moment." They both laughed, deeply satisfied with my completely submissive response. They had absolutely no idea that I was not talking about serving prime rib. Friday morning brought the final intense rush of physical preparation. I told Bradley and Robert that I needed to drive into the city to personally pick up the custom-tiered cake and finalize the last-minute champagne deliveries. They barely waved goodbye, too busy discussing the final guest list to care where I went. But I did not drive to the bakery. I drove my modest 10-year-old Honda Civic straight to the towering glass office building of David Harrison. I sat in David's pristine conference room with my hands folded tightly in my lap. David sat across from me looking exceptionally sharp and incredibly calm. We had Grandpa Charles on a secure private audio line from his room at the assisted living facility. Charles sounded strong and completely resolute. The initial devastating heartbreak of discovering his son's ultimate betrayal had entirely solidified into a cold military determination. David provided the final legal update. The commercial developer is completely panicked. David said, his voice steady and professional. Their broker has been frantically calling Robert all morning trying to figure out why a massive fraud injunction is suddenly attached to their property deed. Robert has been ignoring the calls because he thinks it is just a minor administrative question about the final walkthrough. The developer is actively preparing to withdraw their $3 million cash offer by Monday morning. The entire fraudulent trust is locked down so tight Robert cannot move a single penny. I felt a deep, powerful wave of pure vindication wash over my chest. The financial guillotine was fully loaded and the blade was sharp. I leaned closer to the speakerphone on the desk. "Are you absolutely sure you're ready for this, Charles?" I asked gently. "Once we expose them in front of the entire extended family, there is absolutely no going back. The Gallagher name will be permanently shattered." Charles did not hesitate for a single second. "Clara," he said, his voice echoing with profound absolute certainty, "my son and my grandson have already shattered this family. They lied to me. They stole from you. They actively planned to throw you out into the street and leave me to die in a sterile facility just so they could buy sports cars and boats. They are not my family anymore. Tomorrow afternoon, we are going to show the entire world exactly who they really are." David outlined the precise logistical execution for Saturday. He would arrive at the estate grounds entirely unannounced at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon. He would park his car down the street and quietly blend into the large crowd of mingling guests. I had arranged for a private medical transport service to bring Grandpa Charles to the estate through the rear service entrance, completely avoiding the main driveway where Robert was holding court. Charles would remain hidden in the quiet downstairs study until the absolute perfect moment. "Robert always gives a massive, arrogant toast right at 2 o'clock. David said, tapping his expensive pen against his legal pad. "He loves the sound of his own voice, and he will want all 150 guests paying complete attention to him. Clara, you will let him finish his entire speech. Let him dig his own grave as deep as he possibly can. And when he is done, Charles will walk out of that study and take the microphone. I will be standing right there in the crowd waiting for your exact signal to serve the civil fraud lawsuits and the immediate eviction notice." I nodded slowly, committing the entire timeline to memory. It was a flawless, terrifyingly precise plan. I thanked David and ended the call with Charles. I drove back to the sprawling estate with the custom cake and the cases of expensive champagne, playing my invisible role perfectly. Friday night descended over the estate with a heavy, suffocating tension. The massive clear-top tents were fully erected on the pristine lawn, glowing beautifully under the warm string lights. The white hydrangeas were perfectly arranged on 30 different round tables. The estate looked like a magnificent royal palace, ready to host the social event of the entire decade. I stood alone on the back patio, staring out at the lavish setup, feeling a profound, deep exhaustion deep in my bones. But beneath the intense physical fatigue, the sheer powerful adrenaline of the impending ambush kept my mind completely awake and incredibly sharp. Bradley walked out onto the patio holding a glass of wine. He wrapped his arm casually around my waist and pulled me against his side. He looked out at the glowing tents and sighed with deep satisfaction. "You really outdid yourself this time, Clara," he murmured softly. "This is going to be the absolute best reunion we have ever had. Dad is completely thrilled. You really earned your keep today." I stood completely rigid in his incredibly fake embrace. I looked at the dark tree line beyond the manicured lawn. I thought about the 5 heavy black binders currently locked securely inside the trunk of my car. Those binders contained 36 months of my blood, sweat, and tears. They contained the undeniable forensic proof that I had paid for every single blade of grass we were currently standing on. I did not lean into his touch. I simply stepped away entirely out of his reach and told him I needed to go to bed because tomorrow was going to be an incredibly long day. Saturday morning dawned bright and perfectly clear. The sky was a brilliant, vibrant blue, casting a warm golden light over the historic $2.8 million estate. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple, modest navy blue dress that drew absolutely no attention. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe bun. I looked exactly like the quiet, submissive event coordinator Robert desperately wanted me to be. By noon, the extended family began to arrive in massive droves. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and wealthy country club friends flooded the property, walking through the grand foyer and spilling out onto the beautifully decorated lawn. The air was quickly filled with loud, cheerful laughter, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the rich, heavy scent of catered prime rib. Robert was completely in his element. He strutted through the massive crowd wearing a custom-tailored suit, shaking hands and loudly accepting lavish compliments on his beautiful, historic home. Bradley walked right behind him, smiling arrogantly and acting like the proud, wealthy heir to a massive real estate empire. They were absolutely glowing with toxic pride and stolen confidence. I stayed strictly to the margins of the party, just like I always did. I checked the catering chafing dishes. I refilled the ice buckets. I directed the waitstaff with quiet precision, but my eyes were constantly tracking the heavy mahogany doors of the back study where Grandpa Charles was currently waiting in total silence. I checked my phone and saw a single brief text message from David Harrison confirming he was standing anonymously near the string quartet. The trap was fully coiled. The tension in the air was so incredibly thick I could barely force the oxygen into my lungs. Every single snide, arrogant remark Robert made to his friends, every time Bradley proudly patted his father on the back, only fueled my intense burning anticipation. The clock struck 1:55 in the afternoon. Robert confidently signaled the string quartet to stop playing. He grabbed a crystal champagne flute and a wireless microphone, and he proudly walked to the absolute center of the main clear top tent to deliver his grand toast. The calm before the storm was officially over. The execution was about to begin. I stood silently in the shadows, completely ready to watch the Gallagher men fall. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect clear blue sky that you only see in cinematic portrayals of high society gatherings. The air was crisp but warm, carrying the scent of expensive catered food and fresh blooming hydrangeas. The manicured lawns of Grandpa Charles's estate stretched out like a brilliant green carpet meticulously maintained by landscapers that I had personally paid for earlier that week. And 150 members of the extended Gallagher family had descended upon the property. They arrived in a parade of luxury cars, dressed in their finest weekend country club attire. Pastel dresses, crisp linen suits, and expensive sunglasses were everywhere you looked. The atmosphere was incredibly lavish and deeply celebratory. White, elegant tents had been set up across the vast lawn, providing shade for the impeccably decorated round tables. A live string quartet was positioned near the rose garden, playing soft classical music that provided a sophisticated backdrop to the loud, confident chatter of the family. Walking through the crowd, I carried a tray of champagne flutes, playing the role of the diligent, supportive wife to absolute perfection. Every detail of this party was flawless, and every single bill had been quietly settled from my personal checking account. I had paid for the massive floral arrangements of white lilies and blue hydrangeas. I had paid for the premium open bar where my father-in-law was currently holding court. I had paid for the filet mignon and lobster tail that the catering staff was busily preparing in the massive outdoor kitchen setup. Yet as I moved among my in-laws, the irony of the situation was almost suffocating. The entire extended family treated me with a mixture of polite indifference and barely concealed pity. To them, I was just Clara, the quiet auditor with a boring corporate job who had somehow won the lottery by marrying a Gallagher. I paused near the carved stone fountain to offer a glass of champagne to Aunt Martha and Uncle David. Aunt Martha took the glass without making eye contact with me, her gaze fixed entirely on Bradley, who was standing a few yards away. Bradley was dressed in a tailored navy suit, a brand new Rolex gleaming on his wrist, a watch he had bought just 2 days ago, presumably using the funds they had stolen from my accounts. He was surrounded by younger cousins laughing loudly and gesturing grandly as he spoke. I could hear snippets of his conversation drifting over the soft music. He was talking about market trends, high-yield investments, and the burden of managing substantial family wealth. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a man who had never actually built anything in his life. The younger cousins looked at him with absolute reverence. Aunt Martha sighed happily, taking a sip of the champagne I had bought. She turned to her husband and spoke loud enough for me to hear. She said that Bradley had really grown into his responsibilities. She said the Gallagher legacy was safe in his hands and that Robert must be so incredibly proud to have a son who possessed such brilliant financial acumen. I stood there, keeping a serene and pleasant smile plastered on my face. I nodded agreeably. I did not say a word. I did not mention that Bradley's credit score was a disaster or that he had not held down a stable job in 3 years. I did not tell Aunt Martha that the Gallagher legacy she was so fond of had been entirely bankrupt until I drained my savings to rescue it from foreclosure. I simply offered Uncle David a napkin and moved on. The tension inside me was building with every passing hour, a slow and heavy anticipation. I felt like a coiled spring. I knew exactly what was hidden inside the thick leather binders, resting safely under the main table. I knew that my attorney was parked just 2 blocks away waiting for my text message. And I knew that Grandpa Charles was sitting quietly in his armchair near the head table, watching the entire spectacle unfold with sharp, observant eyes. Whenever my gaze met Charles's across the crowded lawn, we shared a silent, imperceptible nod. He looked frail in his tailored suit, a blanket draped over his knees, but his mind was as sharp as broken glass. He was the only true Gallagher man left, and he was completely disgusted by what his son and grandson had become. We were bound together by a secret pact, and today was the day we would finally execute it. As the afternoon wore on, the guests finished their lavish meals. The catering staff began clearing the china plates, and the bartenders started pouring fresh rounds of expensive wine. The volume of the crowd grew louder, fueled by the alcohol and the joyous reunion of relatives who had not seen each other in years. It was the perfect, picture-perfect family gathering. It was a beautiful lie constructed entirely on my dime. Around 3 o'clock, the string quartet stopped playing. The sudden silence drew the attention of the crowd. Robert Gallagher stepped up to the main microphone positioned at the center of the patio. He looked every inch the wealthy patriarch. He wore a light gray suit that fit him perfectly. His silver hair swept back, a glass of expensive scotch held loosely in his right hand. He tapped the side of the microphone, the sharp thumping sound echoing across the lawn and commanding the attention of all 150 guests. The crowd naturally gravitated toward the patio, forming a large semicircle around Robert. Bradley moved to stand right beside his father, puffing out his chest and crossing his arms, looking incredibly self-important. I stood off to the side near the edge of the crowd, folding my hands neatly in front of me. Robert smiled warmly at the audience. He welcomed everyone, his deep, booming voice projecting easily over the speakers. He thanked them all for traveling from across the country to be here today. He said there was nothing more important in this world than family, and nothing more sacred than the legacy left behind by the generations that came before them. The older relatives nodded in solemn agreement. Aunt Martha actually dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Robert took a slow sip of his scotch and let a serious, reflective expression wash over his face. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of profound gravity. He told the crowd that he wanted to take a moment to reflect on the difficult journey that had brought them all to this beautiful day. He reminded them that just 3 short years ago, the Gallagher family had faced a terrible crisis. He spoke about the dark times when Grandpa Charles's health began to decline. He spoke about the predatory bankers and the ruthless economic conditions that had threatened to tear this very estate away from them. He painted a terrifying picture of impending ruin, a situation so dire that it seemed all hope was lost. And then Robert squared his shoulders and looked out at the crowd with manufactured pride. He told them that when the night was darkest, the true strength of the Gallagher men was revealed. He launched into a completely fabricated, highly detailed narrative of how he and Bradley had stepped up to the plate. He talked about endless sleepless nights, spent crunching numbers in the study. He talked about aggressive negotiations with lenders leveraging every ounce of their business acumen to restructure the family debt. He claimed that they had put their own personal livelihoods on the line, risking everything they had to save the home of their beloved patriarch. It was a breathtaking performance. He spoke with such conviction, such passionate intensity, that if I had not been the one to quietly write the $400,000 check to stop the bank from seizing the property, I might have actually believed him. Robert turned to Bradley and placed a heavy, affectionate hand on his son's shoulder. He told the family that a father could never ask for a better, more dedicated son. He said Bradley had proven himself to be the ultimate protector of the family name. He called Bradley his rock, his partner, and the savior of the Gallagher estate. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Uncles and cousins cheered loudly. People raised their glasses high in the air, toasting the two men who stood beaming on the patio. Bradley smiled modestly, shaking his head a little, as if to deflect the praise, though his eyes gleamed with pure narcissistic pleasure. He soaked up the adoration like a sponge. I stood perfectly still, watching the man I married accept the applause of 150 people for a sacrifice he never made. I watched the father-in-law who had secretly plotted to leave me destitute bask in the glory of my hard-earned money. I felt a cold, calculated calm wash over me. I was entirely detached from the emotional manipulation happening on the patio. I was simply an auditor observing a massive discrepancy in the ledger, waiting for the moment to present the correct figures. When the applause finally began to die down, Robert raised his hands to quiet the crowd. A wide, arrogant smirk spread across his face. The serious, reflective patriarch routine was over. It was time for him to reassert his dominance through mockery. He leaned closer to the microphone and let out a hearty chuckle. He said that while the men were out fighting the financial wars and slaying the corporate dragons, it was important not to forget the quiet contributions of the wives who kept the home fires burning. He scanned the crowd until his eyes locked onto me. He pointed his Scotch glass in my direction, drawing the attention of every single person on the lawn. 150 heads turned to look at me. Robert announced that everyone really needed to give a big round of applause to little Clara. He said that while he and Bradley were carrying the crushing weight of the family legacy on their shoulders, Clara had made the ultimate sacrifice. He paused for dramatic effect, his eyes twinkling with cruel amusement. He told the crowd that Clara had spent 3 agonizing, stressful weeks deciding between eggshell white and ivory for the napkins they were all using today. He joked that the burden of picking the right shade of beige must have been completely exhausting for someone with her limited corporate background. He concluded by saying that it was truly a blessing she had married a Gallagher man, so she would never have to worry her pretty little head about real money or real problems ever again. The delivery was brutal, perfectly disguised as light-hearted family banter. The insult was designed to shrink me, to put me firmly in my place as the useless dependent wife who contributed nothing of actual value to the great Gallagher dynasty. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous. The lawn erupted into roaring laughter. It was not polite, subdued laughter. It was loud booming and completely at my expense. Aunt Martha chuckled so hard she had to hold on to Uncle David's arm. Cousin Greg let out a loud whistle. Relatives I barely knew pointed at me, their faces twisted in amusement. The laughter washed over me in waves, heavy with condescension and pity. They looked at me as if I were a foolish, lucky child who had somehow stumbled into royalty. Bradley did not defend me. He did not step up to the microphone to correct his father. Instead, he walked over to where I was standing at the edge of the crowd. He wrapped his arm heavily around my shoulders, pulling me awkwardly against his side. He squeezed my shoulder tightly, a gesture that looked affectionate to the crowd but felt like a vice grip to me. Bradley leaned his head down his face, inches from mine, and smirked. It was a smirk of absolute victory, of total superiority. He looked at me with eyes that held no love, no respect, and no remorse. He was entirely convinced that he had won. He was entirely convinced that I was trapped, that I was stupid, and that I would simply smile and absorb the public humiliation, just as I had absorbed his financial burdens for the past 3 years. He stood there soaking in the laughter of his family, his chest puffed out, holding the wife he planned to discard on Monday. He was entirely unaware of the storm that was gathering right beneath his feet. He had no idea that the ground he was standing on belonged to me. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply turned my head, met Bradley's arrogant gaze, and gave him the brightest, most terrifyingly serene smile of my entire life. The laughter was still rolling across the immaculate lawn, a wave of collective mockery directed right at me. I could see their open mouths, their thrown-back heads and their eyes crinkled in amusement. I could feel Bradley's heavy arm draped over my shoulder, his fingers digging in just enough to remind me of my place. He was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, soaking up the validation of his relatives. Robert stood at the microphone swirling his expensive scotch, basking in the adulation of a crowd that believed every single lie he had just fed them. The humid afternoon air felt thick, almost suffocating, but my heart was beating with a slow, steady, and incredibly calm rhythm. I was not humiliated. I was simply waiting, because right at that exact moment, the screech of metal scraping against the stone patio cut through the laughter. It was a sharp, grating sound, jarring enough to make the people closest to the head table turn their heads. Grandpa Charles was pushing himself up from his chair. He moved slowly, his hands gripping the armrests, his knuckles white with the extreme effort. He had been sitting silently for so long that many of the guests had almost forgotten he was there, assuming he was just a frail old man enjoying the sunshine in his twilight years. But as he stood up to his full height, pushing the blanket off his lap, there was absolutely nothing frail about the look in his eyes. The laughter began to die down, tapering off into confused chuckles and then into absolute silence. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. You could hear the distant rustle of the wind in the oak trees and the clinking of silverware as guests set their plates down. Robert turned around, his smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he replaced it with a mask of patronizing fake concern. He reached out his free hand, treating his father like a confused, fragile child. He told Charles to sit back down, saying the excitement of the big day was getting to be too much for him and that he needed his rest. Charles swatted Robert's hand away with a sudden violent force that made Robert physically stumble back a step. Charles did not look at his son. He walked straight to the microphone stand. His steps were deliberate and heavy, commanding the attention of every single person on the property. The entire extended family watched in stunned fascination. Bradley dropped his arm from my shoulder, suddenly looking incredibly uncomfortable, the arrogant smirk melting right off his face. I folded my hands in front of me, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my face entirely neutral. Charles grabbed the microphone, pulling it from the stand with a sharp yank. He held it close to his mouth. When he spoke, his voice was not the shaky, tired whisper they were all expecting. It was a roar. It was the voice of the man who had built the Gallagher family from the ground up, a voice that demanded absolute, unquestioning authority. He demanded silence, and the lawn went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the abandoned champagne glasses. He glared at the crowd, his piercing blue eyes sweeping over the 150 relatives who had just been laughing at my expense. He looked at Aunt Martha, who immediately lowered her gaze to her lap. He looked at Cousin Greg, whose wide smile had completely vanished. Then Charles turned his head and locked eyes directly with Robert. Robert swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing prominently, a sheen of nervous sweat suddenly breaking out on his forehead. Charles gripped the microphone tighter. He told the crowd that he had sat there all afternoon and listened to a very entertaining fairy tale. He said he had listened to two grown men stand in front of their entire family and claimed they were the ultimate saviors of the Gallagher legacy. He paused, letting the silence stretch out, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable for the people watching. Then he delivered the question that would shatter their world into a million pieces. "So who really paid for it?" Charles asked, his voice ringing across the speakers with absolute disgust. Before Robert could even open his mouth to stutter a fake response, Charles raised his hand high in the air. That was the signal. From the back of the catering tent, 3 men in crisp, dark suits stepped out onto the lawn. These were not waiters. These were paralegals from my attorney's office, and they were carrying towering stacks of thick black leather binders. The family watched in total confusion as the men walked directly to the tables, dropping one heavy binder in the center of each gathering. The loud thud of the binders hitting the tables echoed across the patio like a gavel striking wood. Charles commanded the family to open them. He told them that if they truly wanted to celebrate the miraculous saving of the estate, they needed to look at the actual receipts. Aunt Martha was the first to cautiously reach out and flip open the thick cover of the binder on her table. Uncle David leaned over her shoulder, adjusting his glasses. Within seconds, a chorus of sharp, genuine gasps rippled across the lawn. I watched their faces change in real time. I watched the horrible realization hit them like a physical blow to the stomach. The first section of every binder was a meticulously organized, chronologically sorted log of cancelled checks and bank transfers. Charles spoke into the microphone, guiding them through the undeniable evidence. He told them to look at the name printed on the top of the accounts. He told them to look at the signatures on the bottom line. Every single check, every single wire transfer for 36 consecutive months bore my name, Clara Gallagher. Charles's voice echoed with righteous fury as he explained the true history of the family. He told them that 3 years ago, Robert had gambled the entire estate into a massive, catastrophic foreclosure. He explained that Robert and Bradley did not have 2 dimes to rub together, that they were drowning in secret debt, and that the bank was days away from changing the locks on the front doors. He looked out at the sea of stunned, pale faces and told them the undeniable truth. "Clara," he said, pointing a finger directly at me. The woman they had all just spent the last 10 minutes laughing at, the woman they treated like a glorified party planner, had drained her own personal life savings of $400,000 to pay off the bank arrears. He told them that she had been quietly paying the $15,000 monthly mortgage out of her own corporate paycheck every single month for 3 years, never asking for a single word of gratitude. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely chaotic. Relatives were flipping frantically through the heavy pages, their eyes widening in absolute horror as they stared at the hard financial proof. Aunt Martha looked up from the binder, her face completely pale, and stared at Bradley with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Bradley was physically backing away from the crowd, shaking his head side to side, stammering loudly that the documents were fake, that there was a massive misunderstanding, and that I was somehow trying to frame them. But his voice was weak and high-pitched, cracking under the pressure. Nobody was listening to his pathetic excuses. The proof was right there in black and white, certified by official bank seals and sworn forensic accountants. The very people who had praised Bradley's financial genius just an hour ago were now looking at him like he was an absolute stranger. But Charles was not finished. He was just getting started with the destruction. He instructed the family to turn to tab 3 in the heavy binders. The crowd moved as one unified entity, flipping the heavy pages over. Charles's voice grew even colder, vibrating with a deep, intensely personal betrayal. He pointed a shaking, furious finger right at Robert's chest. He told the family to look at the legal documents neatly filed in that specific section. He announced that his own son, the man standing before them, pretending to be the great patriarch, had committed a profound crime. He explained that Robert had fabricated a power of attorney document while Charles was heavily medicated and recovering in the hospital explicitly to seize illegal control of the estate and sell it out from under him to foreign buyers. He told the family that the house was never Robert's, to sell that Charles had never signed the final deed over, and that Robert had committed outright felony fraud against his own father. Robert dropped his scotch glass. It shattered violently against the stone patio, sharp shards of crystal and expensive amber liquor splashing across his polished leather shoes. He lunged toward the microphone, holding his hands up defensively in the air. He tried to speak over his father, shouting desperately that Charles was confused, that his new medication was making him severely paranoid, and that absolutely none of this was true. He looked around at the family, begging them to listen to reason, begging them to remember who he was and what he meant to this community. But the crowd was completely dead silent, staring down at the copies of the forged signatures and the expert forensic analysis, highlighting the obvious discrepancies in the handwriting. Robert was drowning in his own lies, and the entire family was standing on the shore watching him sink. The polished veneer of the wealthy, sophisticated country club gentleman was completely gone, replaced entirely by a sweating, panicked, cornered criminal caught perfectly in the spotlight. Charles absolutely refused to let Robert speak. He raised his powerful voice over his son's pathetic, whining excuses, demanding that everyone turn immediately to tab 4. This was the tab I had personally highlighted with bright yellow markers. Charles revealed the most recent, most disgusting theft. He explained that just a few days ago, while Clara was out finalizing the menus for the very party, they were all currently attending Bradley, and Robert had illegally drained $80,000 from Clara's joint savings account. He pointed them to the highlighted bank statements showing the exact hour the money was moved into a dummy corporate account controlled solely by Robert. He looked at the family and asked them if they were enjoying the expensive imported champagne and the perfectly cooked filet mignon. He told them that Clara had paid for their lavish dinner with her hard-earned money, and in return, her own husband and father-in-law had robbed her blind to fund their own selfish escape. The outrage from the crowd was a physical, palpable thing now. Uncle David slammed his heavy hand down on the table, knocking over a crystal water glass that shattered on the grass. Voices were rising in sheer anger all across the lawn. People were shouting aggressive questions at Robert and Bradley, demanding explanations that the two men simply did not have. But Charles raised his hand high in the air one last time, demanding absolute silence for the final, most devastating revelation of the afternoon. He told them to turn to the very last page in the thick binder. He said that stealing from an old sick man and robbing a devoted, hard-working wife was bad enough. But the true rotten depth of their evil was written plainly in those final printed emails. Charles read the emails aloud, his voice thick with unhidden disgust. He read the direct correspondence between Robert and his sleazy, overpriced attorney. He read the step-by-step legal plan to transfer the stolen house into an irrevocable trust, to hide the stolen cash in unreachable offshore accounts, and to viciously serve Clara with divorce papers the very next Monday morning after she had finished cleaning up their party. He read the words exactly as they were written on the page, exposing their cold, calculated plan to leave me with absolutely nothing after I had financed their entire luxurious existence for 3 long years. The silence that followed the reading of those terrible emails was heavy, toxic, and completely absolute. The extended family, the very people who had viewed me as a glorified lucky party planner just moments ago, were now staring at me with a mixture of profound shock, deep crushing guilt, and overwhelming undeniable respect. And then, as if a massive switch had been flipped, the entire crowd turned viciously on Robert and Bradley. It was a visceral, physical shift in the atmosphere. Relatives actually stepped backward, moving away from them, creating a wide, empty circle of total isolation around the two men on the patio. Aunt Martha stood up abruptly from her chair, her face flushed dark red with furious anger. She pointed directly at Bradley and loudly called him a disgusting parasite. Cousin Greg stepped forward from the back of the crowd, his fists clenched tight at his sides, shouting violently at Robert that he was an absolute disgrace to the Gallagher name and that he made him sick. The shouting grew louder and louder, a massive cacophony of deep betrayal and righteous fury directed entirely at the two men who had arrogantly tried to play them all for fools. Bradley looked like he was physically going to be sick right there on the stone patio. He was looking wildly around the lawn, his eyes darting from face to face, desperately searching for a single friendly expression, a single person who would believe his frantic lies. But there was absolutely no one. His wealthy friends, his admiring younger cousins, his doting aunts, they were all looking at him with pure, unadulterated revulsion. Robert was gripping the edge of a high cocktail table, his chest heaving up and down his face, an ugly, mottled shade of purple. He was completely trapped. There was no country club charm left to deploy, no clever corporate manipulation that could erase the mountains of paper sitting on every single table on the lawn. He looked at his father, his eyes incredibly wide with a desperate, pleading terror, but Charles simply looked back at him with cold, hard, unforgiving finality. Then Robert turned his head and looked directly at me. He looked at the woman he had just publicly humiliated for picking out napkins, the woman he had planned to financially destroy and throw away by Monday morning. I stood in the exact same spot I had been in when his cruel joke was told. I had not raised my voice once. I had not shed a single tear of embarrassment. I had simply let the brutal truth do all the talking for me. I met Robert's terrified, panicked gaze, my posture absolutely perfect, my expression completely serene and victorious. The grand, arrogant illusion of the Gallagher men was officially dead, shattered into a million unfixable pieces on their own immaculate lawn, and I was the one holding the hammer. Robert opened his mouth, desperately trying to construct one final lie to save himself. I could see the gears turning in his head, searching frantically for a way to manipulate the crowd of 150 relatives who were currently glaring at him with absolute disgust. He held out his hands, begging for calm, claiming that there was a reasonable explanation for the missing funds and the forged documents. But his voice was weak, lacking the booming confidence that had commanded the patio just minutes before. I did not give him the chance to spin his web of deceit. I simply raised my right hand and caught the eye of my attorney, Mr. Sterling, who had been standing quietly near the edge of the rose garden the entire afternoon. Mr. Sterling was a tall, imposing man dressed in a sharp charcoal suit. He walked through the parted crowd with the slow, deliberate pace of an executioner. The angry murmurs of the extended family died down as he approached the patio carrying two incredibly thick manila envelopes. He did not introduce himself pleasantly. He did not offer a polite country club handshake. He walked directly up to Robert, who was practically shaking with fear, and pressed the first heavy envelope firmly against Robert's chest. Mr. Sterling spoke with a loud, clear voice that carried perfectly across the silent lawn. He announced that Robert Gallagher was officially being served with a civil fraud lawsuit for the forgery of a power of attorney, the illegal transfer of assets, and the direct theft of $80,000 from my personal bank accounts. He informed Robert that the local authorities had also been provided with the complete forensic accounting reports and that criminal charges were actively pending. Robert looked down at the envelope in his hands as if it were a venomous snake. His face turned a sickly shade of grey, and he stumbled backward into a cocktail table, knocking over a silver tray of expensive appetizers that crashed loudly onto the stone. Then Mr. Sterling turned his attention to my husband. Bradley was standing completely frozen, his eyes wide with panic, unable to process the total destruction of his comfortable, parasitic reality. Mr. Sterling handed Bradley the second envelope. He announced that Bradley was being served as a co-conspirator in the civil fraud lawsuit. But that was not all. Mr. Sterling pulled a separate thinner document from his inside jacket pocket and handed it directly to Bradley. He stated clearly for the entire family to hear that these were my official petition for divorce. He told Bradley that he had exactly 30 days to respond to the court and that my legal team would be pursuing full and aggressive restitution for every single dollar he had stolen from me during our marriage. Bradley stared at the divorce papers, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at me, his eyes pleading desperately, hoping that the submissive, obedient wife he had manipulated for years was still in there somewhere. He called my name, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. He begged me to stop this, saying that we could work it out, that we were a team, that he loved me. I looked at him with absolute freezing indifference. I told him that we had never been a team. I told him that I was simply his personal bank and his account was permanently closed. The punishment was immediate, severe, and incredibly public. The extended family, the people Robert and Bradley had spent their entire lives trying to impress and manipulate, began to physically turn their backs on them. Aunt Martha, who had praised Bradley just an hour ago, spat at Robert's feet as she walked past him toward the driveway. Uncle David loudly announced that he would be calling the country club board of directors on Monday morning to demand Robert's immediate expulsion. The wealthy business partners and distant cousins who had attended the party for networking purposes were already pulling out their phones, canceling deals, and rushing to their luxury cars to distance themselves from the Gallagher men. Robert's reputation, his most prized possession, the false image of success he had built his entire identity around, was instantly and irreversibly vaporized right there on the grass. He was no longer a respected patriarch. He was a documented thief, a liar, and a fraud in front of everyone he knew. Bradley, completely frantic and hyperventilating, pulled out his cell phone. He rapidly tapped the screen, desperately trying to log into his banking apps, perhaps hoping to move whatever money he had left before the walls completely closed in around him. But I had already anticipated his panic. Thanks to the emergency injunctions Mr. Sterling and I had filed earlier that week, the courts had moved with brutal swiftness. Bradley stared at his phone screen in absolute horror. He started shouting, waving the phone in the air, claiming that his accounts were locked. He yelled that he had zero access to his savings, or his credit cards. He looked at Robert, demanding to know what was happening, but Robert was too busy sobbing over his own lawsuit to even acknowledge his son. I watched Bradley realize the gravity of his situation. He could not even buy a gallon of gas. He was completely broke, wearing a stolen Rolex watch that my attorney would soon force him to surrender to pay his legal fees. But the final, most devastating blow of the afternoon did not come from me, and it did not come from my attorney. It came from Grandpa Charles. Charles had watched the entire scene unfold from his chair on the patio. He looked at his son and his grandson, two men who had arrogantly tried to steal his home and strip him of his dignity. He slowly pushed himself up to his feet again, leaning heavily on his wooden cane, but standing with immense, undeniable pride. He approached Robert and Bradley, who both cowered slightly under his intense, furious gaze. Charles told them that they had disgraced the Gallagher name forever. He told them that they had tried to strip a dying old man of his home, and they had viciously abused the one person who had actually sacrificed her own security to save this family. His voice was filled with a deep, crushing disappointment that seemed to physically shrink Robert and Bradley down to nothing. Charles announced that he was formally and legally evicting them from the estate, effective immediately. He ordered them to pack their bags and leave the property before sunset, warning them that if they were still on the grounds by nightfall, he would have the local police physically remove them for trespassing. Robert tried to argue, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He begged his father not to do this, claiming that they had nowhere to go, that their accounts were frozen, and that they would be entirely homeless. Charles did not show a single ounce of pity. He looked at his son with cold, hard eyes. He told Robert that homelessness was exactly what Robert had callously planned for Clara, and that it was fitting poetry that he would now experience that exact terror for himself. He told his son that he had no father, and that the Gallagher estate would never welcome him back. Then Charles turned his back on the men who shared his blood. He walked slowly over to where I was standing near the fountain. The entire remaining crowd watched in absolute silence, holding their collective breath. Charles took my hands in his trembling, weathered hands. His eyes were shining with unshed tears, but his expression was incredibly clear and completely resolute. He spoke loudly, ensuring that every person still standing on the lawn heard his final decree. He told the family that Clara was the only person with true honor in this entire generation. He declared that I had protected him when his own flesh and blood had tried to throw him away for cash. He announced that he had already signed the final legal paperwork with his attorneys that very morning. As direct repayment for the $400,000 I had sacrificed to save the property from foreclosure, and as a sincere apology for the terrible emotional abuse I had endured from his son and grandson, Charles was transferring the deed to the estate legally, entirely, and permanently to me. The house, the sprawling grounds, the legacy. It all belonged to Clara Gallagher now. The words hung in this beautiful afternoon air, ringing with the sweet, unmistakable sound of absolute justice. Bradley let out a strangled, pathetic cry of disbelief. He finally realized that the massive inheritance he had been waiting his entire life to receive had just been handed directly to the wife he had treated like a worthless maid. Robert sank to his knees on the stone patio, putting his head in his hands, completely broken by the reality that he had lost his home, his wealth, his reputation, and his father in a single afternoon. I stood there on the lawn, holding Charles's hands, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over my entire body. I looked around at the magnificent estate, the towering oak trees, the beautiful stone fountain, and the white tents blowing gently in the breeze. I had spent 3 years paying for this property, in secret working endless hours at my corporate auditing job, enduring constant humiliation and believing that my sacrifices would never be acknowledged. I had believed I was trapped in a miserable, suffocating life with people who viewed me as nothing more than an automatic teller machine. But as I watched Robert and Bradley stumble away toward the massive oak doors of the house to pack their miserable bags under the watchful, unforgiving eyes of my attorney and the few remaining family members who had stayed just to witness their ultimate downfall, I realized that I was finally completely free. The heavy burden I had carried for 3 years was gone. The extended relatives who had mocked me earlier began to cautiously approach me. They came forward with their heads bowed, their faces red with shame, offering sincere, stumbling apologies for their terrible behavior. They admitted that they had been completely blinded by Robert's lies, and they praised my incredible strength and resilience. I accepted their apologies with a calm, polite nod, but I did not let them back into my heart. I had learned my painful lesson about the conditional love of the Gallagher extended family. I knew now that my worth was not determined by their fleeting approval, and I no longer needed their validation to know my own strength. I had secured my own future, protected the only man in this family who actually deserved it, and armed myself with nothing but the truth, a stack of cancelled checks, and the unwavering courage to simply say enough. The sight of Bradley carrying a cheap duffel bag out of the front door, his expensive suit wrinkled and his head hung low, was an image I would burn into my memory forever. Robert followed close behind him, looking like a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had toasted to his own greatness just an hour prior. They walked down the long, winding driveway on foot, because my attorney had already secured the keys to the luxury cars they had purchased with my stolen funds. They were walking away from the $2.8 million estate, stepping out into the real world where their last name meant absolutely nothing without the bank account to back it up. I watched them shrink into the distance, two tiny, insignificant figures against the beautiful landscape of my new home. And for the first time in 3 years, I took a deep, clear breath of fresh air. It has been 6 months since that afternoon on the lawn. Life at the estate is completely different now. The heavy, suffocating tension that used to fill these hallways is gone. I am no longer working 80-hour weeks to fund the extravagant lifestyles of two grown men who despised me. Instead, my corporate auditing career is thriving on my own terms. I finally took that promotion I was putting off. When I come home now, the house is quiet and peaceful. Grandpa Charles and I usually spend our evenings on the patio sharing a quiet dinner and talking about real things instead of listening to Robert boast about imaginary business deals. Charles is doing much better too. Without the constant stress and emotional manipulation from his son and grandson, his health has actually improved. We hired a wonderful nursing staff to assist him, and we spend our weekends tending to the rose garden. As for Bradley and Robert, I heard through the grapevine that they are currently renting a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Bradley is finally working as an entry-level salesman at a local dealership. Robert is entirely cut off from his former country club friends. Their toxic presence is completely erased from our lives. I sleep soundly every single night, knowing my hard-earned money is securing my own future and protecting a good man who actually treats me like family. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my story, it is this. You can never buy love or respect from people who only view you as an automatic teller machine. For years, I thought that if I just worked harder, paid for more things, and stayed quiet, I would eventually earn their genuine affection. I thought that keeping the peace meant sacrificing my own financial security and emotional well-being. But I learned the hard way that a one-sided sacrifice is not love. It is simply exploitation. Setting boundaries is not a betrayal. Standing up for yourself and your hard work does not make you a bad person. It makes you a survivor. Do not let toxic people drain your bank account or your spirit just because they happen to be family or in-laws. You have the absolute right to protect what you have built. I hope my journey gives you the courage to look closely at the relationships in your own life and demand the respect you truly deserve. If you found satisfaction in seeing two arrogant parasites finally face the consequences of their greed, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. It really helps this community grow. I also love reading your responses, so please drop a comment with the word justice, along with your current location and what time you are watching this video. Thank you so much for listening, and remember to always protect your peace.